There is a moment in the very first season where Kenny dies, and then the next week he is back, and nobody in the show, nobody at all, says a single word about it. Not his mother, not his brother, not the friends who watched him die the week before. Tonight, on Paper Town, we are going through every loose thread, every contradiction, every quiet bit of broken arithmetic that South Park has gathered over almost 30 years of being on the air. Not the small animation slips, the real ones. The ones that change a character's father, or rewrite a death, or quietly delete a child from existence. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. We have a long, slow walk ahead. To talk about plot holes in South Park, you have to start with the orange parka and the muffled voice, because Kenny McCormick is the show's first and largest contradiction, the one the writers built the early seasons around and then quietly pretended did not exist. In the first run of seasons, Kenny dies almost every episode. He gets hit, crushed, electrocuted, eaten, exploded, dissolved, sometimes by accident, sometimes by something more pointed. And the gag is that Stan and Kyle look down at the body, shout the line about killing him, and then the next week he wanders back into the bus stop with his hood pulled up and his mother in the kitchen and a brand new sweater on his lap. The show does not explain it. The boys do not seem to remember. His parents never bury him, never grieve, never panic when their son fails to come home from school for the 40th time in a row. There is no funeral economy in South Park, no town newspaper that runs his obituary every week, no overworked coroner with a special drawer labeled with his name. It is just absorbed into the air of the town, the way the snow is absorbed and the cold is absorbed, and you are meant to find that funny rather than impossible. For 4 full seasons, the show does this without a single line of dialogue explaining why he keeps coming back, and that silence is the joke. But it is also a hole in the floor of the entire premise because every other character in this town is treated as continuous. Their relationships build, their parents recur, the school year sort of advances. Only Kenny is exempt from the rules of cause and effect, and the show pretends not to notice. Then in the 5th season, in the episode where Kenny dies of an incurable illness, the writers seem to make a real decision. They kill him in a slower, more deliberate way than usual, and they leave him dead. And for almost an entire following season, he is gone, replaced in the bus stop quartet by other characters, by Butters, by Tweak. The implication is clear, the joke is over, he is properly dead, and the show is moving on. Then they bring him back in the closing minutes of the next season finale with a hand-waved line and no real explanation, and he simply slots back into the group as if nothing has happened. If you sit with that for a moment, it is genuinely strange. The show acknowledged his death long enough to mourn the gag, then undid the mourning and never wrote a proper bridge between the two states. Years later, in the Coon Trilogy that ran across the show's superhero arc, the writers gave him a kind of retroactive explanation, suggesting that Kenny is in fact unable to die, that he returns each time with no memory, and that his parents forget too, because of a cult ritual involving the Cthulhu mythos and a pregnant mother and a botched ceremony before he was born. That sequence is presented as canon, narrated in his own voice from inside his hood, and it tries to retrofit a meaning onto everything you saw before it. The problem is that even that explanation does not reconcile the original gag, because in the original episodes, Kenny clearly stays dead until next week, which is not what the Coon Trilogy describes, and because for long stretches of the show, Kenny is not dying at all, just attending 4th grade like everyone else. The retcon is generous, almost loving, but it does not patch the hole, it paints over it. The narrator in that arc is sad about what has been done to this child, not triumphant about having solved a riddle. So Kenny remains the founding contradiction of South Park, the one the writers chose to live inside rather than fix. And once you accept that, the rest of the show's broken arithmetic becomes easier to forgive. The next great unanswered question in South Park is time itself, because these 4 boys have been in the 4th grade for the better part of 3 decades, and the show has tried at least 3 different ways to explain why. In the earliest seasons, the kids are in 3rd grade. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny sit in a classroom with Mister Garrison and Mr. Hat, and the seasons turn around them with Halloween and Christmas and the end of school, the way they do for any cartoon set in a small town. After a couple of years, the kids move up a grade to the 4th, and Mr. Garrison goes with them. And there's an episode where this is treated as a real structural change with a new classroom and new desks and a real sense of forward motion. And then time stops. They stay in the 4th grade for the next 2 decades and counting. They have Halloweens and Christmases and summer holidays and Easter and Valentine's Day, sometimes 3 of them in a season, and never, not once, do they age out of that classroom in any permanent way. Within the world of the show, this is impossible. Calendars are referenced. Current events are referenced, often the very current events the episode is responding to that week. A presidential election happens, then another, and the boys remain 10 years old through all of them. The show has occasionally acknowledged this. There are jokes about how long Ike has been a toddler, about how Shelley has been a teenager for years, about how Kenny's baby sister, who arrives mid-run, never seems to grow up either. The writers wink, but they never give you a mechanism. The closest they come is in the pandemic specials, which we will get to later, where the boys briefly age into adulthood and then snap back, and in a few flash-forward gags where you see grown-up versions of them. Those moments suggest the writers do think of the boys as having a future, just one that the weekly show refuses to enter. The whole, then, is not just that the kids do not age, it is that the world around them does. Every other thing in the town adjusts to the current decade. The phones change, the slang changes, the politics change, the references change. The kids are the only fixed points, and the show has chosen never to explain why. Cartman's father is the cleanest example of South Park rewriting its own past on purpose. Very early in the show, across the close of the 1st season and the opening of the 2nd, there is an entire 2-part mystery built around the identity of his father, with all the men in town getting tested, and a Maury-style reveal episode that is one of the show's most quoted hours. And the answer in that reveal is not a man at all. It is Cartman's own mother, Leanne, played as having both sets of organs, with a long, shaggy joke about her chromosomes and her past at a Denver Broncos game, and the implication that she is in fact Eric's biological father as well as his mother. For years, that is the canon. It is referenced in offhand lines. It is brought up by the other boys when they want to wound him. It sits at the bottom of his character like a sediment. Then, in the show's 200th episode and the follow-up that aired the next week, the writers tear the whole thing up. In that 2-part celebration of the show's anniversary, the truth is overturned. Leanne is not a hermaphrodite at all. She is just his mother. The real father, the writers now say, is Jack Tenorman, a former Denver Broncos player whom Cartman, years earlier, had unknowingly fed to his own son in Chile, in one of the show's most famous revenge episodes. That earlier episode, the Scott Tenorman story, had been the high watermark of Cartman's cruelty. And now its meaning is flipped. The boy he tortured is his half-brother. The man he killed and ground up is his own father. It is a magnificent piece of writing in that it takes a beloved old episode and forces you to reread it. It is also, by any normal measure, a retcon. The show explicitly contradicts something it told you for almost 10 years. The original reveal at the football game cannot also be true. The writers have hand-waved that the earlier tests were wrong, that the conclusion at the time was a misread, that Leanne simply has a complicated history that confused everyone, but you are left with an episode whose central plot is now officially incorrect within its own continuity. The show does not pretend the old version did not happen. It just decides that it was misdiagnosed and trusts you to come along. That decision also creates a second, quieter contradiction, because if Jack Tenorman is Cartman's father, then Scott Tenorman has been suffering the death of his own parents for years, across the show, without knowing he was suffering them at the hands of his half-brother. The Chile scene, played originally as the apex of one child's cruelty toward another, becomes an accidental patricide and a doubled tragedy. The show acknowledges some of this. Scott returns in later episodes to seek revenge and is treated as a permanently broken figure. But the show never quite goes back and lets the boys, or even Cartman himself, sit with the full weight of what the retcon implies. Cartman knows briefly in the anniversary episode, and then the knowledge fades into the background. He never tells his mother that her child is actually the son of a player she met one night. He never sits down with Scott. He never seems to carry it. By the next regular episode, he is back to his old self, scheming and complaining and tormenting Kyle, and the only person who appears to remember the revelation in any structural way is the audience. A central piece of family history is changed. Every prior episode that depended on the old version is left untouched, and the new version is allowed to fade out of memory because the show works better when Cartman is simply Cartman and his mother is simply his mother. The writers have, in interviews, treated the original reveal almost as a long con. They have said the second answer was always the real one, whether that is honest or whether it is the most graceful way to admit a change after the fact. The result on screen is the same. A son with two canonical fathers, a mother with two canonical biologies, and a town that is chosen, again, not to mention it. The transformations of Mister Garrison are their own quiet category of contradiction, because the show has changed his identity at least 4 times, and each change has been treated as if it were the final and obvious truth. In the early seasons, Mister Garrison is the boy's teacher, a strange, brittle, suburban man with a hand puppet named Mr. Hat, who delivers most of his angrier opinions for him. Mr. Hat is, in those early seasons, treated as a real part of the schoolroom, with his own personality and his own arc, and the show carefully implies that Garrison is using him to say things he cannot say himself. Then Mr. Hat is replaced briefly by a second puppet, Mr. Twig, and then Mr. Hat returns. Then Garrison comes out as a gay man in a storyline that takes him through a partner named Mr. Slave. Then, in the show's 9th season, Garrison has surgery to transition into a woman, and becomes Mrs. Garrison for several years, taking the boys through 4th grade still, in the same classroom, with the same hand on the same chalkboard. Then, in a later season, she has another surgery, this time to reverse the first, and becomes Mr. Garrison again with a long, satirical speech about regret that the show plays half straight and half for shock. Then, much later, in the run leading up to the show's election year arcs, Mr. Garrison becomes a presidential candidate, then a president in a thinly veiled parody of a real campaign, and stays in that role for the better part of 2 seasons before quietly leaving office. Through all of this, he never stops being the 4th grade teacher. The classroom is always there to come back to. After his presidency, there is no real reckoning with what it would mean for a sitting president to return to teaching elementary school in Colorado. He is simply back at his desk with the same students in the same room, and the show acts as if you will not notice. Each individual change, considered alone, can be defended. The puppet was a coping mechanism. The transitions were the show engaging with cultural questions of their moment, sometimes clumsily, sometimes more thoughtfully. The presidency was a satirical detour, but laid end to end, Garrison's biography is a tangle that no one in the town ever discusses. The other teachers do not adjust. The boys do not adjust. He returns to the same chalkboard each time as if the chalkboard itself has a kind of amnesia. That is the real contradiction. Not any single transformation, but the way the world around him refuses to remember any of them. Chef is the great absence of South Park, the loss that the show has never properly written its way through. For the first 9 seasons of the show, Chef is one of the central adult characters, the cook in the school cafeteria who doubles as a kind of advisor to the boys, dispenser of soulful advice and slightly inappropriate songs, voiced by the late musician Isaac Hayes. He is the warm pulse of the early show, the only adult the boys consistently trust, and his songs about love and the various other appetites of a grown man are among the most beloved running bits in the early years. Then in 2006, the show and Hayes part ways under unhappy circumstances. The exact details have been argued about for years, and there are several versions of the story, but what is documented is that an episode mocking Scientology, which Hayes was associated with, was followed by his departure, and the show responded with an episode in its 10th season that wrote the character out. In that episode, Chef returns to South Park having been brainwashed by a cult called the Super Adventure Club, behaves in increasingly disturbing ways toward the children, attempts to flee with them, falls off a bridge, is mauled, and is then, at the very end, briefly resurrected as a kind of demonic figure. The boys eulogize him, in essence, by saying that the chef they knew was good and that whoever spoke through his mouth in that final stretch was not really him. It is a peculiar piece of television, both because the show is openly working through a real off-screen falling out, and because the writers chose to handle that falling out by destroying the character on screen. The gap, though, is not the destruction itself. It is everything that came after. In the years since, Chef has occasionally returned in dream sequences, in flashbacks, in the elementary school cafeteria as a ghost, and even, in at least one episode, as a kind of presence in heaven. None of those returns reckon with the manner of his death. None of them ask whether the dark figure who pushed the boys off the bridge in his final episode was ever properly defeated, what the Super Adventure Club did to him, where his soul ended up. He simply hovers at the edge of the show now, a warm voice in flashback, a memory the kids occasionally summon when they need comfort. That is sweet, and it is also unresolved. Chef died, was demonic, was redeemed only by the boys' polite refusal to consider the dark version their friend, and then the story moved on. The town never really grieved him in any extended way, and the canon has never gone back to clarify what happened to whatever the Super Adventure Club put inside him. Pip is the cleanest disappearance the show has ever performed, and the cleanest because no one in the show has ever acknowledged it. Pip Pirrip is the small, polite English orphan who attends the boys' classroom from the first season onwards. He has his own episode, an entire send-up of Great Expectations cast in the show's style, where he is the lead and the rest of the cast take the supporting roles. He is the only main classmate with that distinction in the early run. He is bullied constantly by Cartman in particular, but also by almost everyone else, and most of the running jokes about him involve his foreignness and his quietness. Then in a later episode involving the rampage of a kaiju-shaped Mecha Streisand, Pip is crushed. The show is explicit about it. He is squashed on screen with a comic flatness, and the line moves on. There is no funeral, no eulogy, no nameplate on a desk. The next time the camera scans the classroom, he is simply not there. Mister Garrison does not call attendance and pause. Stan does not turn to Kyle and ask whatever happened to that polite British kid. The character is excised with the same casual cruelty that the bullies in the classroom used to treat him with when he was alive. The contradiction here is not whether he died. The show is unambiguous about that. The contradiction is the response or the lack of response by the entire town. Pip had an orphan's history, an inheritance plot, an entire episode about his rise and fall in the social pecking order. He had recurring appearances at school plays and town events, and then he was deleted, and the world did not adjust. Years later, when the show goes back to the classroom, the empty desk has been quietly filled, often by Token, often by Kevin, often by no one at all. The show has never once gone back to acknowledge what was done to him. There are fan theories that the writers simply tired of the character, that the actor associated with him was no longer involved, that the show wanted to clean out the seating chart, and any of those theories may be true on the production side. But within the canon, there is a child who was killed by a giant, rampaging figure in a public ceremony, and a town that is never noticed, and a classroom that is never mourned. The longer the show runs, the more conspicuous that silence becomes. The school staff in general behave as if they are passing through one of those revolving doors that hotels put in their lobbies, because South Park Elementary has gone through more head teachers, principals, counselors, and assistants than any small mountain school could realistically employ. The earliest run had Principal Victoria, an unflappable woman who handled the day's worst crises with patience and a sense of irony. She was fired very abruptly in the show's 19th season, replaced by a character called PC Principal in a stunt that the show used to satirize the cultural conversation of that particular year. PC Principal has now been in that role for almost a decade of episodes, longer than Principal Victoria ever was, and the show has never gone back to address what actually happened to her after her firing. She was last seen as a private citizen of the town, occasionally turning up at the back of crowd scenes, and the show has shown no particular interest in her aftermath. Mr. Mackey, the counselor with the surgical scrub voice and the tendency to end each sentence with a small affirmation, has been there from the very beginning and has weathered every principal change with the same unchanged tie. He survives. He is the constant. But the rest of the staff rotate. Mr. Garrison is sometimes the teacher, sometimes Mrs. Garrison, sometimes briefly the kindergarten teacher after a sideways move that the show treats as a minor punishment, sometimes the country's president. Miss Chalksendick takes over the 4th grade for a stretch and then dies, with an episode about the cause of her death that becomes one of the show's strangest. Mr. Adler runs shop class, often weeping. Miss Information, Miss Stevens, the new 4th grade teachers who appear in later seasons. The substitutes parade through. Each of them is treated as if they have always been there. None of them are remembered when they go. The hole in the staffing is not the turnover. Schools do have turnover. The hole is the way the boys never seem to feel any of it. A teacher they have known for years dies, and they have one episode to react, and then she is gone. Another teacher transitions and changes and runs for president, and they sit at the same desks the entire time. A new authority figure is parachuted in, and the boys treat him as if he has always been there. The arithmetic does not add up because the show is treating South Park Elementary as if it were a sitcom set, where any new face can be slotted into the same chairs without comment, while at the same time treating the town as if it were a real place with continuous history. Both cannot be true. The show simply lives in the contradiction. Token Black, who is one of the longer-running classmates in the show, is the subject of one of the most explicit retcons in the run. For more than 20 years, he is called Token. The name is read by everyone, including him, as a reference to the fact that he is, in the early seasons, the only black child in his grade. The show has made jokes about this many times, sometimes through Cartman, sometimes through the parents, sometimes through the irony of the name itself. Then, as far as fans have pieced together from a streaming era special and the season around it, the writers reveal that his name has actually been spelled with an L all along. He is Tolkien Black, named for the author of The Lord of the Rings, and the joke is that everyone in town and everyone watching has misheard it for 2 decades. The boys are mildly chastened to learn this. Tolkien is mildly weary about it. The show plays the moment for the squirm of recognition, the sense of having been the butt of a longer joke than you realized. But of course, it is also a retcon. In earlier episodes, the name is shown on screen. In one of those very early episodes, the show explicitly riffs on the idea of token as a token, with a real comment about diversity in the classroom. Either those earlier episodes had a spelling that the writers later changed their minds about, or the show has always been double bluffing, and the early visual gags about the name have been quietly reread. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have addressed this in interviews and have basically taken the second line, claiming the long con. Whether you believe them or not, the result inside the show is a contradiction. The same letters on a nameplate do not now mean what they used to mean. The earlier scripts have been overruled by the later script. And Tolkien, the character, is left absorbing the weather of it with the same patience he has shown for years. He is, if you think about it, the most consistently treated child in the cast, the boy with the responsible parents and the steady demeanor, and the show has, for almost the whole run, treated him as a flat type before opening up his interiority quite late. The wrinkle, in his case, is not malicious. It is the way the show repeatedly resets its own jokes and trusts you to come along. The introduction of member berries is the closest South Park has ever come to acknowledging on screen that its own continuity is unstable. In the 20th season, the show built a season-long arc around Little Purple Fruit, who whisper memories of older pop culture into the ears of the people who eat them gently, persuasively, until those people are voting against their better judgment and longing for a past that the berries have airbrushed. The satire was about the contemporary appetite for reboots and for an idealized past, but the device sat inside South Park's own world in a strange way, because South Park has been doing exactly that for years. The show's running gags lean heavily on remember when, on did you used to like, on a kind of warm, shared cultural memory. Member berries are South Park making a joke at the expense of its own form. The trouble comes after the season ends. The berries, which had been treated as a genuine sentient threat, with their own arc and their own villain reveal, are mostly defeated and the world moves on. But the berries themselves do not entirely disappear. They turn up in later episodes, sometimes as background detail, sometimes as a plot device that needs no further explanation. There is never a clean cleansing of the town. The infestation, treated for an entire season as a near-apocalyptic force capable of swaying elections, is allowed to dissolve into the wallpaper of the show. The same is true of the season-long election arc that ran alongside the berries, with Mister Garrison turning into a Trump-shaped figure and ending up in the White House. Big national stakes, then a quiet return to 4th grade. The contradiction is not the satire. The satirical stakes are real inside the show, and the show treats them as real for the duration of the arc, and then treats them as if they were always small once the arc ends. The town saved itself from purple sentient fruit, and the boys at the bus stop never speak of it again. The Coon Trilogy is one of the most ambitious story arcs in the show's history, and it is also where the show first tries to make the broken arithmetic of Kenny's deaths and the kids' powers cohere into a single mythology. Across 3 episodes in the show's 14th season, and then a longer Coon and Friends arc in the same season, Cartman invents a superhero identity for himself called the Coon, then conscripts the other boys into a costume team that takes itself with degrees of seriousness none of them share. Kyle is Human Kite, Stan is Toolshed, Kenny is Mysterion, Butters is Professor Chaos, Token is Tupperware, Timmy is Iron Maiden, Clyde is Mosquito. The conceit is a parody of the modern superhero film, but in the middle of all the parody, the writers fold in something stranger, which is the explanation, mentioned earlier, for why Kenny does not die. Mysterion takes off his mask. He tells Stan and Kyle that he has been killed many times and that he always wakes up the next morning in his bed, and that his parents do not remember, and that he does not remember most of it himself. The boys are appropriately horrified. Then in a later episode in the arc, his mother, in flashback, attends a meeting of a cult that worships old cosmic horrors, and a ritual goes wrong, and the result is a child cursed with an inability to stay dead. The show treats this as canon. The narration is in Mysterion's own voice. The other boys do not entirely understand it, but they receive it. Then the arc ends, and the show goes back to its normal week-to-week pattern, and Mysterion is largely set aside, brought out only when a specific episode wants to use him. The contradiction within the contradiction is that this explanation, which retrofits the gag of Kenny's deaths into a real mythology, is not consistently honored by the show afterwards. Kenny continues to live mostly normal weeks. He does not die in every episode. When he does die, the narrative around it does not always reach back to the Coon trilogy for support. The cosmic curse is a thing that happened to him in one set of episodes and then largely vanished from his life again. The writers wrote it because the gag had become too heavy not to address, and then they shrugged it off because addressing it every week would have made the show unwatchable. Both choices are defensible. Together they are a whole. ManBearPig is the show's clearest example of changing its mind, and changing its mind so cleanly that the show has effectively made the change into a joke. In the show's 10th season, the creature called ManBearPig is introduced in an episode where the former Vice President Al Gore visits the boys' school and warns them about a beast that is half man, half bear, and half pig, a being that they are told represents an existential danger to the world. The episode is plainly a satirical jab. Al Gore in the show is treated as a comic figure whose alarm about a non-existent monster is mocked, and the children spend the episode being dragged through caves while the former vice president shoots at shadows. ManBearPig in that episode does not exist. He is presented as a delusion. The show was using the figure as a stand-in for what the writers, at the time, evidently thought was a comparable kind of overblown environmental alarm. Years later, the show changes its position. In the show's 22nd season, there is a 2-part arc and a follow-up special, in which it turns out that ManBearPig is real, has been real all along, has been killing people in the town and the surrounding region for years, and has been protected by a deal that Satan made on the town's behalf in exchange for prosperity. The show, in this later arc, lets Al Gore come back, mostly in the right, and lets the boys realize that he had been telling the truth and they had been laughing at him. The metaphor lands cleanly. The contradiction is that within the show's own continuity, the early episode now has to be reread. In the original episode, the boys were dragged through caves chasing what was clearly nothing. In the later episodes, the monster is real and was there. Either the boys were chasing nothing and the monster in those caves simply did not happen to encounter them, or the original episode was a lie and the kids were always in real danger and never knew. The show does not resolve this. It lets the new canon overwrite the old in spirit while leaving the old episodes untouched. It even uses, in the later arc, the same image of the creature, now rendered as actually dangerous, that had been the joke of the older episode. The retcon is intentional. The hole left behind by the retcon is allowed to stand. Imaginationland is the show's strangest acknowledgement of its own metaphysical status, and it leaves behind one of the largest unsolved questions in the canon. In the show's 11th season, the writers built a 3-part film, later released as a single feature, in which the boys discover that everything humans have ever imagined is real in a separate plane of existence, and that the wall between the imaginary and the actual has been broken by a terrorist attack. The result is an entire war fought across a pastel landscape, with cartoon characters and folk monsters and beloved children's heroes on one side, and the more frightening contents of human imagination on the other, with the United States military trying to nuke the entire imaginary realm out of existence, and Kyle in the middle of it, making the argument that what is imagined can be just as real as what is physical. The film ends with imagination saved, the boys returned home, and a line from a character suggesting that the show has now permanently acknowledged that everything it has shown you takes place in a kind of imaginative space. That line, considered carefully, is a destabilizing one. If everything imagined is real, then every figure South Park has ever invented exists. The boys have, by the end of that film, met Jesus, Santa Claus, Strawberry Shortcake, the Care Bears, and the figures of Greek mythology in the same room, and have treated them as physically existent. The question opens when you ask what status, after Imaginationland, anything in South Park has. There is no clear line between real and imaginary in the town anymore. The writers seem to have realized this and have, for the most part, simply moved on. They tell normal stories about normal events in the town and do not refer back. The Imaginationland canon turns up only when the show wants to. The wall the boys broke has, by silent agreement between writer and viewer, been quietly repaired. But the line of dialogue is still in the script. The show has officially stated, on screen, that everything you can imagine is real, and then proceeded as if it had not. That is a gap large enough to walk through, and the only thing covering it is the boys' 4th grade routine. Mr. Hanky is one of the most beloved early characters of South Park, and his status by the end of the show's run is genuinely uncertain. Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, is a sentient piece of excrement who appears every Christmas in the show's early seasons, and sings to Kyle, who is the only person who can see him at first, and then to the town at large in later episodes. He has a wife, an unhappy marriage, 3 children, and at one point, a comeback arc where he becomes a Hollywood agent. The show treats him through most of the run as a real, if unusual, citizen of South Park. Then, in the show's 22nd season, the writers wrote an episode in which Mr. Hanky is essentially canceled. The town turns against him, his old behavior is rediscovered, his contracts are torn up, and he is exiled to Springfield, the hometown of The Simpsons. The episode is a satire of public shaming, with Mr. Hanky as the figure whose old jokes have not aged well, and it ends with him driving away into the unknown. The town moves on without him. The lingering wrinkle sits in the fact that he is, after that, almost never mentioned again. He had been the figurehead of Christmas in South Park for decades. Children believed in him. Kyle, in particular, had built much of his Christmas mythology around him. Then he is gone, and no one rings the bell. There is no follow-up about whether he ever made it back, whether Kyle still believes, whether the town's Christmas now has any center at all. He has appeared in the odd background frame since, but the question of what now governs the season in South Park is left dangling. The writers have, in interviews, treated Mr. Hanky as a character they retired with affection. Inside the show, the retirement is given a hard send-off and then no aftermath. Ike Broflovsky is the youngest child in the Broflovsky household, the boy with the round head and the curious vocabulary, and his biography is full of contradictions that the show has both invented and ignored. In the first seasons, Ike is described as Kyle's little brother, taken at face value with no particular qualifier. Then, in an early season episode, he is revealed to be adopted, and not only adopted but Canadian, and the show plays with the gag that he has always been part of the family and that no one in the family had thought to mention it. From that point onwards, Ike is one of the show's recurring jokes about Canadian identity. He is whisked away by his biological parents for an episode, then returned. He goes to Canada at intervals, sometimes for adventures, sometimes for political crises. He grows, very slowly, into a more talkative child who occasionally surprises the show with the speed of his vocabulary. He has, at one point, an affair with his kindergarten teacher in a storyline the show plays at a deliberately disquieting register. He has, at another point, a moment of suicidal despair in an episode that handles the subject with surprising tenderness. The contradiction is the speed of his aging. Ike is a toddler in the first seasons. He is still a toddler now. By the time the show acknowledges this 3 decades on, the gap between his obvious mental development and his physical age is enormous, and the show has not tried to explain it. He is also Canadian, which in South Park means that he has a different style of animation when the show wants to use the Canadian motif, and his face is sometimes drawn the Canadian way and sometimes not, with no clear rule for when. He is the most movable child in the cast, and his biography is the one that the writers seem most willing to bend whenever a particular episode needs him to be a specific kind of younger sibling. The whole, then, is not that he is too young. It is that the show has decided he is exactly as young as it needs him to be in any given week. Butterscotch is, by general agreement among fans, the breakout secondary character of the show, the boy who graduated from background to near main cast across 2 decades of slow expansion. He is also the character with the most internal contradictions, because Butters is at least 3 different boys depending on which episode you happen to land on. In some episodes, Butters is the picture of innocence, a child whose parents are gentle and whose worldview is unprotected from cruelty. In other episodes, those same parents are revealed to be controlling and at times abusive, with Butters spending entire arcs grounded in his bedroom and his father in particular treated as a danger. In a third register, Butters takes on the costume of Professor Chaos and becomes a small, hateful villain who tries to drown the town in tinfoil and Easter eggs. The split is the way these 3 Butters do not really fit. The innocent boy and the abused boy are different children. The villainous boy and the trusting boy are different children. The show occasionally tries to bridge them, with episodes about how the boy's optimism is a coping mechanism, or about how Professor Chaos is the place where his suppressed anger lives. But the bridges do not really hold. The parents in particular are not consistent. They wander between cartoonish punitive and gently absent, and once, in the episode Margarine, weep with worry over their missing son in a way that contradicts the version of them we see elsewhere. A grandmother of his arrives once and is a monster. She is then never spoken of again. Butters has had a girlfriend in Hawaii, has been mistakenly identified as a girl named Margarine, has been a pimp, has worked for the government, has fought in the Coon Trilogy, and has been an exchange student in his own life so often that any attempt to build a coherent biography becomes farcical. The show, of course, does not care. Butters is a vehicle for whatever the writers need a vehicle for that week. But the result, taken across the run, is that he is the character whose canon is the least stable. And the people closest to him, his parents, the staff at his school, his classmates, behave as if they have selective memories about all of it. Terrence and Philip are a paradox inside South Park's own logic, and the show, to its credit, has played with that paradox more than once. In the early seasons, Terrence and Philip are the boys' favorite television show, a low animation farce involving 2 Canadian men whose comedy is built almost entirely on flatulence. The boys watch them, quote them, idolize them, and then meet them in person when the show needs to send the kids to Canada. From the first meeting onwards, Terrence and Philip exist as real people in South Park's world. They have careers, scandals, marriages, custody battles. They feature centrally in the South Park film, where the boys attempt to see one of their films triggers an entire war between the United States and Canada. They appear in town, they walk around, and yet, simultaneously, in the boys' living rooms, they continue to appear as cartoon characters on the boys' televisions, in episodes of their own animated show within the show. The show has occasionally winked at this. There are scenes where the boys watch the cartoon Terrence and Philip while the real Terrence and Philip are in the same town. There are jokes about the difference between the men and their on-screen versions, but no real reconciliation is ever made between the 2 facts. Are the cartoons reruns of an old animated series about real people? Are they animated reenactments of real events? Is one version the dream of the other? The show never decides. It allows both to be true, which is frankly fitting, because South Park itself is the cartoon you are watching about a town that the show sometimes implies is just as real as any other Colorado town. Terrence and Philip are the place where South Park acknowledges, very quietly, that the boundary between real and animated within its own world is more porous than the show usually lets on. The pandemic specials are where South Park made its only serious attempt to age the boys, and the inconsistency of what they did is one of the most discussed contradictions of the late run. In 2020, the show released on streaming a feature-length episode called The Pandemic Special, set in the same week of the year it aired, in which the boys are still children, but the world around them has been rearranged by the virus. That episode keeps the children as children, treats them as 4th graders trying to navigate the closures and the masking and the social rearrangements of that year, and lands with them more or less intact. The following year, however, the show released a pair of feature-length specials called Post-COVID and Post-COVID, The Return of COVID, in which the boys are adults. The conceit of those specials is that something has gone genuinely wrong in the years after the pandemic, and that the boys have grown up into the kind of men they had always feared they might become. Stan is divorced and alcoholic. Kyle is a tense and lonely scientist. Cartman is a Hasidic rabbi with a wife and children. Kenny is dead, or as dead as Kenny ever is. The specials use time travel to send their adult selves back to their childhoods and then to a future point. And the events of those specials, by the end, are partly undone and partly retained. The wrinkle is that the regular show has never followed through. Subsequent regular episodes have continued to treat the boys as fourth graders, with the same friendships, the same crushes, the same parents, the same teachers. The adult futures shown in the specials are not referenced in the weekly run. The show, in interviews, has treated the specials as alternate timelines or possible futures, rather than as established events, and that framing works for some of it, but the specials themselves do not present that way. They present as a real arc of growth. The result is two versions of the boys held in superposition, one in which they will become these particular men, divorced and lonely and quietly broken, one in which they will remain, forever, the boys at the bus stop. The show has chosen to live in both at once. Wendy and Stan have one of the longest-running romances in animated television and one of the least continuous. Wendy Testaberger is introduced almost immediately as Stan's girlfriend, treated by the show as the small, polite, fierce counterpart to a boy who is otherwise mostly defined by his friends. They date, they break up, they date again. Stan vomits whenever Wendy speaks to him directly in some episodes and not in others, with the show using the gag as a marker of his nervous fondness but never establishing rules for when it is active. Wendy is sometimes a slightly conservative figure, sometimes the show's clearest voice for second-wave feminist commentary, sometimes a small avenger who hunts down those who have wronged her with cold, almost murderous attention. She is the one who kills Cartman with a beating in one of the show's most cheered moments. She is the one who, in another episode, goes through a transition arc that the show plays mostly for satire about gendered athletics. The wrinkle inside their relationship is the way the breakups never seem to mean anything. There's an episode in which Wendy leaves Stan, and the writers play it as the end of the show's central romance, with both children mourning the relationship in different ways, and then the next time the show needs them to be together, they simply are together again, with no bridge written between the two states. The same is true in reverse. The show has used their relationship as a heart of certain emotional arcs, and then dropped it the moment the emotional arc has served its purpose. Wendy is, structurally, one of the most fully written girls in the cast, and yet her commitment to Stan is treated by the show as a switch the writers can flick on and off depending on what kind of week the show wants to have. The whole is not the changing of her feelings. People change their feelings. It is that the show treats those changes as immediately reversible, with no consequences, and that Stan and Wendy meet each new episode with no apparent memory of the last one's outcome. Heidi Turner has the saddest version of this same problem. Heidi is a background classmate for the first 16 or so seasons of the show, present in crowd scenes, occasionally given a line, never given a personality beyond what the moment requires. Then in the 20th and 21st seasons, the writers built her up into a real character by pairing her with Cartman, in a relationship that began as a kind of internet feminism arc and curdled, very quickly, into one of the most uncomfortable depictions of an abusive relationship in any animated show. Cartman, in that arc, manipulates Heidi, isolates her, denigrates her body, controls what she eats. The show plays this with surprising seriousness for stretches at a time, with Kyle in the role of the friend who can see what is happening and who cannot quite get her to leave. The arc ends when Heidi finally breaks free of Cartman, with a kind of triumph, in a late episode of that run. The aftermath is everything afterwards. Heidi, once the arc concludes, returns almost entirely to her old background status. She is rarely the lead. The damage of the relationship is not really explored further. Cartman is not, in any structural way, made to face her again. The next time he has a storyline, he is back to his old jokes, back to tormenting Kyle, back to making demands of his mother. The show does not abandon Heidi exactly, but it does set her down very quickly after using her, and the arc that for 2 seasons looked as if it would change the center of gravity of the cast vanishes back into background noise. The whole, in her case, is the show's reluctance to let a serious story have serious aftermath when that aftermath would interfere with the weekly comedy. Cartman gets to keep being Cartman, and Heidi pays the cost. PC Principal arrived in the show's 19th season as a satirical commentary on a particular cultural moment, and the show has now lived with him long enough that he has become a piece of furniture. He is a man in a backwards cap and sunglasses who insists on the language of political correctness, even as he behaves with naked aggression. He bullies, he punches, he runs the school as if it were a fraternity. In his earliest episodes, the satire is quite pointed. The show is using him to mock what it perceives as a particular failure mode of progressive activism. Then, as he settles into the cast, the show softens him, gives him a girlfriend in the form of strong woman, lets him father a brood of small versions of himself called the PC babies, lets him appear in episodes that are not about political correctness at all. The whole is that the show has never gone back and dealt with the fact that PC Principal physically assaulted students. In the early episodes, he is shown striking, in particular, a child. Those scenes are played as part of the satire. In later episodes, when he is being treated as a real and warm presence in the school, the show acts as if those earlier moments did not happen. There is no episode in which the parents who would surely have sued him surface to do so. There's no moment of accountability. He simply becomes, over time, just the principal, and the boys move on. South Park has done this with many of its abrasive figures, allowing them to start as satire and then settle into the background as recurring characters. But PC Principal is the most extreme case because what he did in those first appearances would, in any other story, end a career. Mister Garrison's run as president is one of the largest swallowed pieces of canon in the show, and it is one of the most fascinating to revisit because while the satire was running every week, the show seemed prepared to let it carry serious weight, and once it was over, it was put away as if it had been a long, bad dream. In the show's 20th season, the writers used Garrison as a Trump-shaped figure, with the show campaigning for him on a stage made of insult and bluster, in a parallel run with the actual real-world campaign of that year. The episodes of that season chased the actual news week by week, with predictable difficulties given the speed of writing, and Garrison's campaign ends, as the real campaign did, with a victory. The next season has him in the office, holding press conferences in a small gold-lined room, dealing with foreign policy, dealing with Putin, dealing with the leader of Canada. Then, very gently, across episodes, he slides out of office and back into his life. The show never quite shows the moment of resignation in detail. There's an episode in which he steps down, but the procedural side is handled vaguely. And by the time you next see him, he is in his classroom again, with his old students, with his old chalkboard. The whole is enormous. A sitting president returning to teaching the 4th grade in a small mountain town would normally generate news. There would be Secret Service, there would be protests, there would be press at the school gates. The show makes none of this happen. Garrison is simply, after a brief silence, the teacher again. The town treats him as the teacher again. The boys treat him as the teacher again. It is as if the country in the show's world is on a slightly different timeline from the country in the show's world, and the writers have asked you not to ask which one is real. Scott Tenorman's family is, after the retcon of Cartman's father, one of the most quietly tragic threads in the show, and the writers have never properly reckoned with the size of what was done. In the original Scott Tenorman episode in the 5th season, the older boy bullies Cartman, and Cartman, in a piece of cruelty that the show treats as both terrible and slightly admirable in its scope, arranges for Scott's parents to be shot by a farmer who mistakes them for chicken thieves, and then for the bodies of those parents to be ground up and served to Scott as the chili at a chili festival. The episode ends with Scott eating his own mother and father and crying in the snow, while Cartman drinks the tears off his face. It is one of the most quoted moments in the show's history and one of the bleakest jokes the writers have ever told. Then, 200 episodes later, the writers reveal that the man Cartman fed Scott was Cartman's own father. The implication, taken to its conclusion, is that Cartman is responsible for the death of his own father and the maternal half of the boy who is now his half-brother. Scott has appeared in occasional episodes after that revelation, often furious, often plotting, and the show has played his rage as comic. The unaddressed weight is that the show has never really sat down with Cartman in the way that this story would warrant. never let him grieve or even consider what was lost. The character runs on, the town runs on, Scott runs on into more revenge plots that mostly fail. There is no episode in which Leanne and Scott meet, although they are now, in a sense, his only family. There is no episode in which Cartman attends a memorial for the father whose name he now knows. The retcon was a brilliant move on the page. The implications the show has chosen to outrun. The death of Eric Cartman is an episode that briefly proposes the most metaphysical of South Park's many premises and then is mostly forgotten. In the show's 9th season, Cartman misbehaves at a family gathering by eating his cousin's celebratory chicken pot pie, which the cousin had specifically saved, and the other boys decide collectively to pretend to him that he has died and that he is now a ghost only Butters can see. The episode is built around the running joke that Cartman, believing himself to be a ghost, begins to atone for his sins, makes a list of all the people he has wronged, and visits each in turn to apologize. He does, in this state, undo a small portion of his accumulated cruelty. The catch is that the episode ends with the gag being revealed and Cartman being mortified, and then those apologies, which had real and visible effects on the people who received them, are forgotten in subsequent episodes. The people he had wronged and made small amends to are treated, the next time you see them, as if those amends had never happened. The episode is essentially walled off from the rest of the show, a contained one-off, despite ending on a note that any other show would build into a longer arc. The boys also never quite faced the question of why they assume Cartman would, on believing himself dead, automatically begin to repent. The episode argues, in passing, that some part of him knows he is wrong, that there is something inside him that wants forgiveness. The next episode treats him as if that part of him does not exist. The wrinkle is small but telling. The show, in this episode, glimpses a Cartman with an interior life and then turns away. He is funnier without one. Sparky was Stan Marsh's gay dog, the central figure of the show's 4th ever episode, in which Stan learns that his pet is what the schoolyard insults of the time would have called by the slur, and in which Sparky leaves home for an adventure with a mountain lion before returning to be accepted by his owner. The episode is fondly remembered as one of the show's earliest moments of warmth, and Sparky is, in those first appearances, treated as a real and beloved family pet. He vanishes. By the show's later seasons, Stan's family has had several different dogs, none of them named Sparky, and Sparky himself, with his specific shape and his specific story, is not really mentioned again. There is no episode in which he dies. There is no episode in which he is rehomed. He simply slips out of the show the way a real childhood pet can slip out of a child's memory, and the family acts as if he had never been there. South Park's pet population in general is unstable. Stan has had multiple dogs over the years, some of them named, some of them just present in the kitchen. Kyle has a dog called Ike, which is in fact also his brother's name, although that is a joke for the audience and not a continuity break. The Marsh family has had cats appear in single episodes and never return. In the case of Sparky, the loss is more sentimental than structural. He was treated in his episode as if he mattered very deeply to Stan. He has not been treated as if he mattered since. Damien is one of the great early teases of South Park. In the show's first season, a new boy joins the 4th grade. He is dressed in black, his face is pale, his eyes are heavy-lidded, and within an episode it has been established that he is the literal son of Satan, sent up to the surface to find friends and to bring about a kind of end of days. The episode in question ends with him fleeing in tears after the other boys reject him, and with his father appearing in the sky to fight Jesus in a comedy boxing match. Damien is, by the end of that single episode, treated as if he might be a recurring presence in the show. He is a child with cosmic ties. He has powers. He has unfinished business at the school. He is the son of one of the major recurring figures in the South Park afterlife. Then he is essentially never seen again. There are a small number of background cameos across the years, glimpses in crowd scenes, single-line cameos in heaven sequences, but Damien as a developed character is dropped after that first episode and never picked back up. The unanswered question is what should logically have followed. The show has, since that episode, returned to hell many times. Satan has been a recurring character with multiple love interests, with a long arc about leaving Saddam Hussein, with parental concerns about being a single father. None of those storylines ever bring his son back. Damien, who would have been the obvious connection between the schoolyard and the underworld, is left dangling. The show seems to have decided that a permanent half-human, half-demon child sitting in the 4th grade was either too much to manage or too easy a joke to keep. Whatever the reason, Damien is the boy the show invented and forgot, and his absence is one of the quieter mysteries of the early canon. Dr. Alphonse Mephisto, the genetic scientist who lives at the edge of South Park with his small, chattering companion, is one of the show's most surreal recurring characters and the figure behind one of its most quietly upsetting reveals. In a first season, 2-parter, Mephisto is the answer to the question of Cartman's father, kind of. He runs the genetic tests on the local men. He presides over the dramatic reveal sequence at the Maury show set. He is the man with the answers. He returns several times in early seasons, mostly to perform genetic experiments on the boys' pets or on themselves. He has cloned Stan. He has produced animals with too many limbs. He is the show's stand-in for the mad scientist and is treated at first with respect and a kind of comic dread. Then he simply tapers off. He is in a coma for an episode and recovers off-screen. He appears in passing crowd scenes. He has, in recent years, almost no role at all. The structural problem is that Mephisto's experiments produce beings who, by the logic of the show, would still exist somewhere. The 5-assed monkey he made for one episode, the various clones, the chimeric pets, none of them have been accounted for. They were treated as real and dangerous in their original episodes, and then they were dropped. South Park does this often. It invents a piece of mythology, plays with it for an episode, and never goes back to clean up what it left behind. Mephisto is the patron saint of that habit. He is the man whose lab is full of unfinished business and whose unfinished business the town has simply chosen to forget. Big Gay Al is the show's first major gay character, introduced in the show's first season in an episode that, for its moment, was treated as surprisingly tender. He runs a big gay sanctuary for the gay animals of the town. He sings a song about being proud of who he is. He helps Stan reconcile with Sparky. He returns in subsequent seasons, sometimes as a scoutmaster, sometimes as a wedding officiant, sometimes as the town's voice on questions the writers want to play with affection. He marries Mr. Slave in an episode that the show treats as a quiet victory. Then he largely vanishes. In his case, the gap is not malicious. He simply slips out of the rotation as the show develops new characters. But within the canon, there is a married couple, prominent citizens of the town, with their own arc and their own reception, and the show has not bothered to update viewers on what has become of them. They are not divorced. They are not estranged. They are simply not seen. Mr. Slave appears even less than Big Gay Al, and Mister Garrison's old partner, who once nearly killed his ex by being kicked into the sun, is now one of the loosest threads in the show. The writers have allowed minor characters to drift in this way for decades. Each individual disappearance is small. The accumulated absence is the size of an entire side cast. Jimmy Valmer and Timmy Birch are the boys' 2 disabled classmates, and have the dubious distinction of being introduced in subtly conflicting ways. Timmy arrives first in the early seasons as a boy in a wheelchair whose vocabulary consists mostly of his own name. He becomes a recurring figure in the boys' classroom and one of the show's most loyal background presences, included in field trips, in crowd scenes, and superhero teams. Then in a slightly later season, Jimmy arrives, also a boy with a disability, also a boy who uses crutches, also a regular at school events. The show stages, briefly, a kind of rivalry between them. There is an episode in which Timmy resents Jimmy's arrival and the 2 children are made to work out their relationship on stage at the school assembly. The episode ends with reconciliation. Then they are mostly just friends. The drift here is small. The treatment of the 2 boys' speech patterns has shifted over the years, with Timmy's vocabulary in particular changing without explanation. He sometimes speaks more clearly than at other times. The show seems to use his voice as a flexible instrument depending on what the joke of the episode requires. Both boys have moments of unexpected dignity. Both boys are also sometimes treated as the punchline. The writers cannot quite seem to decide what register they want for these 2 children, and the result is a pair of figures whose abilities and limits drift episode to episode. Mr. Slave is another character whose biography has been swallowed. He was introduced as the gay lover of Mister Garrison in a mid-run season with a thick Eastern European accent and an unflappable patience. He becomes engaged to Garrison, then breaks up with him over the question of marriage. then later marries Big Gay Al instead in a ceremony that the show plays as both a victory for the couple and a defeat for Garrison's worst instincts. He is, for several seasons, a real presence. He appears in classrooms, in the schoolyard, in family gatherings. He is at one point briefly the boys' substitute teacher. Then he largely vanishes. His case mirrors Big Gay Al's. The marriage that the show built up across multiple episodes has no aftermath. The show does not see him as a recurring family unit. Mr. Garrison has gone through his presidency, has gone through his many transformations, has gone through partnerships with men and women, and Mr. Slave is not present for any of it, not even at the edges. He is one of the show's most distinctive supporting figures, and he has been quietly placed in storage. The wrinkle here is the sheer asymmetry between his introduction and his disappearance. He had songs, he had catchphrases, he had a wedding, now he has nothing. The town's geography has never made internal sense. South Park is described in the show's title sequence and across the run as a small mountain town in Colorado. It has, in those terms, the population of a village. There is a single main street with a single set of shops, a single elementary school, a single supermarket, a single police station, a single small fire crew. The total cast of named adults in the town is small enough that you could fit them at a few tables. And yet, episode by episode, South Park has the infrastructure of a small city. It has a TV station of its own, a newspaper, a planetarium, several large churches, a sushi restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, a tofu restaurant, a Whole Foods, a Walmart, a Costco, a strip mall, a movie theater, several bowling alleys, a stadium, a small zoo, a large hospital, a community college, a marijuana dispensary district. It hosts conventions. It hosts national news anchors. It hosts entire branches of the federal government. None of these would fit comfortably in the village the show purports to be. The mismatch is so deeply baked into the premise that the show has occasionally turned it into a gag. There is an episode in which the town's residents discover, to their shock, that they live in a place with more amenities than they realized, and an episode in which a Walmart attempts to colonize the town's economy in a way that suggests the writers know that South Park has a downtown bigger than its population would justify. But the show has never resolved the contradiction. It needs South Park to be small enough that everyone knows each other and large enough that any week's plot can be staged in it. So it lets the two scales coexist, and the town's geography becomes, in effect, made of jelly. The town's population is the other side of the same paradox. There are episodes that suggest South Park has only a few hundred residents. There are episodes that suggest, in passing, that it has tens of thousands. The boys' school has only one class per grade, taught by one teacher each. The boys' parents seem to know everyone, and yet, in episodes about news coverage and protests, the town can produce crowds of thousands. In one episode, the town stadium fills with cheering fans. In another, a marathon course winds through neighborhoods you have never seen before. The contradiction is, again, a baked-in flexibility. South Park is sized to fit the joke. When it needs to feel claustrophobic and gossipy, it has a single bus stop and a single corner pub. When it needs to feel like a real American town with real American problems, it has the population of a small city. The show never explains this. It does not need to. It simply scales up and down. And the result, after almost 30 years, is a place that, viewed all at once, simply is not the same place from week to week. Stan's grandfather, Marvin Marsh, is the center of one of the show's earliest dark episodes, in which the elderly man asks the boys repeatedly to help him die. The episode is built around the gag of Stan being unwilling to assist with assisted suicide, and Marvin's increasingly desperate attempts to recruit other people to his cause. It is an unsettling piece of writing with real philosophical content underneath the comedy, and it ends, in essence, with Stan refusing to help and Marvin reluctantly accepting that he must continue to live. The thing the show has never returned to is the subject. Marvin is a recurring character. He attends family gatherings. He is sometimes warm, sometimes cantankerous, sometimes briefly sinister. He has been used in several later episodes for jokes about old age, about dementia, about the indignities of nursing homes. He has not, in any of those returns, been allowed to remember that he once spent an episode begging his grandson to kill him. The arc is sealed. The character is allowed to be elsewhere now. The boys have not been allowed to remember either. Stan, who in that early episode is shown to be deeply uncomfortable with what his grandfather is asking, never seems, in later seasons, to be marked by the experience. The wrinkle is the simple fact that a child carrying that particular memory would, you would think, behave a little differently around his grandfather than he does. The show has decided that he does not. Kyle Broflovsky's Jewishness is one of the most consistent things about him and one of the most inconsistently played by the show, depending on which season and which writer you happen to be in. From the first episodes, the show establishes that Kyle is Jewish, that his family observes the holidays, that Cartman uses his Jewishness as a perpetual lever for cruelty, that his mother Sheila is, in particular, the show's caricature of a forceful, protective, occasionally embarrassing Jewish parent. That last figure is a long-running joke in the show, one Kyle himself has fought with for years, and the show has handled her with varying degrees of affection. There are episodes in which Sheila is the only adult in the town behaving morally, organizing other parents into action against threats that they had ignored. There are episodes in which her interventions are presented as overreach. The whole is in the show's own handling of Kyle's faith. In the early episodes, Kyle is treated as actively observant. He prays. He goes to synagogue. He worries about being a good Jew. There is an entire arc set across 2 episodes in one of the show's earlier seasons in which Kyle is convinced that he has lost his soul because Cartman has tricked him into being baptized. Cartman has tricked him by claiming that all Jews end up in hell, and Kyle's loss of faith and his eventual recovery of it is treated by the show with surprising care. Then, in much later seasons, the show treats Kyle's Judaism as more or less a costume. He still goes to family events, he still defends his faith when Cartman attacks it. But the inner life of a Jewish child trying to live in a small Christian mountain town, which was clearly something the early show was interested in, has been largely allowed to fade. The character it set up at the start would, you would think, have a more developed sense of his own religion by now. Instead, he is, in essence, the boy who pushes back against Cartman's slurs, and his faith is the place from which the pushback comes, and that is mostly the whole of his religious life, as the show now writes it. The episode in which Kyle and his family go to New Jersey is one of the show's strangest pieces of background mythology, and it created a subcanon that the show has, since largely declined to use. The episode is called It's a Jersey Thing, and it sits in the show's 14th season. The premise is that Sheila Broflovsky is secretly from New Jersey, and that her natural state when she returns there is to become a kind of cartoon of an angrier, harder, hairsprayed version of herself. The implication, played as a kind of body horror, is that the entire population of New Jersey is something other than American, and that Sheila has been suppressing this nature for years. Kyle, the episode reveals, is also half Jersey, and at the climax of the episode, he discovers that he too can transform, that there is a Jersey version of himself who is harder, ruder, more aggressive than the boy we know. The episode ends with the town protected from a Jersey invasion and Kyle and his mother safely de-Jerseyed. The unsettled lore is the part that comes after. If Kyle is half Jersey, that fact has, in the language of the show, real consequences. He has a hidden self. He has a heritage that, when activated, transforms him. The show has not, in any subsequent episode, returned to that idea. Kyle has gone back to being a thoughtful Colorado 4th grader. The transformation, presented in that episode as a powerful and dangerous thing, has not happened to him again. Either it is a piece of mythology that is true only inside its own episode, in which case the canon is being used as ad hoc table dressing, or it is true everywhere and the show is choosing not to mention it. Either reading is uncomfortable. The episode itself is also one of the show's heaviest satires of regional stereotype, and the writer's handling of New Jersey identity has been criticized in the years since. The character lore that the episode embedded into Kyle is, even setting the satire aside, a serious continuity break that the show has chosen to ignore. The Mormons of South Park are the subject of one of the show's most lovingly handled episodes and one of its largest gaps. In an episode from the show's middle period, the writers introduce a new family in town, the Harrisons, who arrive on the bus from Utah and turn out to be relentlessly cheerful, kind, helpful, and faith-filled. The episode is one of the show's clearest moments of generosity. Stan's father comes home a different man after one evening with the family. The episode ends with a small, devastating speech from the Mormon son to Stan in which he says that he knows his religion's founding story sounds ridiculous, that he understands why people laugh, and that what he cares about is what the religion makes him do day to day, which is to love his family and be kind. The wrinkle is that the family is then dropped. They are not part of the recurring cast. They do not appear in classrooms. The town does not seem to remember them with any specific affection. The same generous spirit toward Mormonism is not extended back into the show's other religious arcs, where Mormons appear briefly as targets of jokes. The show clearly has a complicated relationship with Mormon belief, treating the doctrine itself with broad satire and the people who hold it with surprising warmth, and the disappearance of the Harrison family is the place where that complicated relationship becomes a visible gap in the canon. They were there. They were the closest thing the show had to a model family. Then they were gone. The town has not since had anyone like them. Scientology in South Park is the subject of one of the show's most controversial episodes and the source of a permanent fracture in the show's own behind-the-scenes history. In the show's 9th season, the writers built an episode around the Scientologist beliefs surrounding Tom Cruise, with on-screen text that explicitly described the church's internal teachings. The episode also features Tom Cruise refusing to come out of a closet in a long joke about a real piece of tabloid speculation. The episode itself is, in canon terms, an unusually quiet one in terms of continuity. Stan briefly becomes the head of the church, then publicly disavows it. The town moves on. The gap is, in part, the lack of long-term consequence in the show's world. The town turned out, for that one episode, to be home to thousands of Scientologists who had recognized Stan as their messiah. The episode ends with the church suing him. The lawsuit is never followed up. The thousands of Scientologists vanish from the town. South Park returns to being the South Park you know. The much louder consequence is the off-screen one, with Isaac Hayes leaving the show, with reports of the episode being pulled from rotation in some markets, with the broader question of the show's relationship to celebrities who pursued legal threats. The strange thing in this case is the way the show's biggest off-screen rupture is barely reflected on screen. Hayes' departure was handled by Killing Chef. The Scientology storyline itself was barely followed up. The town simply went back to its routines, and the writers in subsequent seasons did not, for many years, return to the church in any major way. The boys' video games are an interesting category of South Park canon because the two major games released about them in the last decade are explicitly described by the writers as canonical. The first, The Stick of Truth, follows a new boy who has moved to South Park and who is drawn into an elaborate live-action role-playing game that the boys are running, with Cartman as the king of one faction and Kyle as the leader of another. The game is full of references to the show, includes a Canadian arc that takes the new boy briefly out of town, and features adult and parental characters at length. The second, The Fractured But Whole, follows the same new boy through a sequel in which the boys are no longer playing fantasy heroes, but instead the superhero personas from the Coon Trilogy. Both games end with significant changes to the boys' lives and significant additions to the lore. The whole is that the show, in the years since the games, has not really integrated their events. The new boy, who in the games is a major character given by the player's hand, has appeared in the show only in cameo. The events of the games, including a number of significant additions to the family histories of the cast, are referenced rarely. The writers have said in interviews that they consider the games part of the canon, but the canon does not extend the courtesy back in a structural way. South Park, as a weekly television show, simply does not behave as if those games happened in any reliable, weight-bearing way. Either they are canon, in which case the show owes their events more recognition, or they are an alternate canon, in which case the writers should not say they are part of the same world. The contradiction has been allowed to sit, partly because the show benefits from it. The games are richer for being treated as part of the same story. The show is freer for not being constrained by their endings. Cthulhu and the larger cosmic mythology that the writers wrote into the Coon Trilogy are another set of dangling threads. In the trilogy and the wider arc that surrounded it, the show introduced a real metaphysical bedrock for South Park, in which old gods exist, in which the cult that worships them has been active in the town for years, and in which the boys' superhero team has, at one point, fought one of those old gods directly. The arc ends with the kids more or less victorious, Cthulhu, after a brief alliance with Cartman, is sent back to his realm. The cult is briefly dissolved, Kenny's curse is partly explained, then the entire mythology is essentially shelved. The show does not return to it in any deep way in subsequent seasons. The boys' superhero personas appear from time to time, but the underlying cosmology does not. The wrinkle, in this case, is the strangest. The writers wrote an explicit, considered metaphysics into the show for the length of an arc, and then chose not to mention it again. Why South Park? Why the cult chose this town? Why Kenny was the child to receive the curse? None of these are followed up. The show simply walks away. It is, in its way, a very South Park decision. The arc was for that arc. The next week is the next week. The story does not have to add up. Mecha Streisand is the show's most absurd recurring villain, a robot kaiju version of the singer Barbra Streisand, who appears in 3 different episodes across the show's run, transforming each time into a giant kaiju and terrorizing the town. The first appearance is in the show's first season, in which Mecha Streisand is summoned by the use of a magical triangle and is defeated by a team of celebrities including Robert Smith of The Cure. The second appearance is in a later season, in which she returns, transforms again, and is defeated again. The third appearance is in a streaming-era special. The catch is small but persistent. The show treats each appearance as more or less the first. The town does not seem to have institutional memory of Mecha Streisand. There is no civil defense system for Streisand attacks. There is no plaque downtown marking the prior battles. The boys do not seem especially weary at the news that she has appeared again. The writers are clearly using her as a returning joke, a button they can press, and that button does not, by design, require any setup. The price is just the cost of using her that way. South Park has experienced an actual kaiju attack at least 3 times. The town behaves each time as if it is not. Randy Marsh's slow takeover of the show is the largest accumulated wrinkle of the last decade, because Randy has, by degrees, become the show's true main character without the show ever properly establishing the transition. In the early seasons, Randy is the boys' geologist father, a slightly bumbling, kind enough man who works at a real workplace and who occasionally pulls his family into a particular week's adventure. By the show's middle period, he has become the louder of the town's parental voices, the man whose enthusiasms become the engine of the plot, the husband who briefly becomes a child pop star named Lord, the husband who briefly becomes the king of the food court at the local mall, the husband who, at one point, runs around the town as a kind of one-man chaos engine. By the late period, he is the proprietor of Tegrity Farms, a marijuana operation that he founded after a creeping moral arc about wanting to be a better man. Tegrity Farms is the dominant setting of the show's most recent half-decade. Episodes about Stan's life are often, in fact, episodes about his father. The biographical whole is that Randy's job, in the early seasons, was clearly defined. He was a geologist working for the United States Geological Survey. Across the later seasons, that job has effectively vanished. He is, at various times, a wine sommelier, a pop singer, a Whole Foods consultant, a farmer, an entrepreneur, a community leader. The show has never really decided what he does, because what he does in any given episode is whatever the episode needs him to do. The whole, then, is the kind of whole that a man with steady employment would not have. The writers have made Randy into a kind of weather vane that points whichever way the country is pointing at the moment of broadcast, and the cost of that flexibility is that he no longer reads as a single coherent man. Sharon Marsh has a parallel and quieter version of the same whole. In the early seasons, she is the boy's mother, often the only adult in the room with patience, often the moral check on her husband's wilder ideas. She has a job somewhere off-screen, the details of which the show has never settled. She is a department store clerk in one episode, then a banker, then a homemaker, then a community organizer. Her relationships with her husband and children move from warm to tense to nearly broken and back again, with major arcs about whether she will leave Randy that end with her not leaving Randy but never quite reconciling with him either. The episode in the show's 15th season called You're Getting Old leaves the Marsh family in a state of dissolution, with Stan watching his parents prepare to divorce, with the boys' friendships fraying, with everything turning on screen into a horrible image. The follow-up the next week, called Asperger's, walks much of that back. The family reconciles, the friendships recover, The boys are fourth graders again, the unresolved weight is what you're getting old set up, and what Asperger's refused to honor. The marriage was, in that episode, basically over. The world had, in that episode, basically curdled for Stan. The follow-up resolves all of that with hand waves, and the show goes on as if the storm had not arrived. The episode remains one of the most beautiful in the show's run. The hole it left, the show simply walked around. Stan's drinking arc is one of the show's least addressed bits of canon. At the end of the 15th season, in the You're Getting Old, Asperger's pair, Stan begins to drink. He drinks not as a joke, but as a way of making the world bearable, which is itself a deeply uncomfortable thing for a fourth grader to be doing. The show plays it as both a satire of cynicism and as a real symptom. By the end of the two-parter, Stan is functioning again, but the show has not quite committed to saying that he is no longer drinking. He is, in subsequent episodes, occasionally seen with a beer. There is no follow-up. The post-COVID specials, years later, give us an adult Stan who is an alcoholic, which is plainly meant to be the long-term version of the early teenager who started drinking to manage his depression. But the show, in its weekly run, has never returned to the question. Stan is treated each episode as a normal child. He has not, in the regular series, been written through any kind of recovery. The whole here is whether the show is acknowledging that there is, sitting inside Stan, a problem that has not gone away, or whether the writers have simply forgotten the arc. Either reading is uncomfortable. The first means that the boy at the bus stop is being quietly destroyed in front of us, and that the show is choosing not to mention it. The second means that the show has lost track of one of its own most serious arcs. There is a generous reading that lets both be partially true, that the writers know Stan is wounded and have chosen, week to week, not to dwell on the wound. That reading lets the show off the hook for the inconsistency, but does not really repair it. Officer Barbrady is the town's chief of police for the first 15 or so seasons of the show, a man whose competence is treated as a joke and whose presence is treated as a kind of warm fixture. He is the first officer on every scene. He has a wife at home briefly, he is illiterate in one episode and then literate in another. He is friend and adversary to the boys depending on what the episode needs. Then, in the show's 19th season, in the same season that introduces PC Principal, Barbrady is fired by the same wave of reform that brought PC Principal in. He shoots a young Latino boy in a scandal that the episode plays as a satire of police violence. He is dismissed in disgrace. The replacement is a new chief who is more in tune with the satire of the moment. Barbrady, after that, is largely gone. He has had a small number of cameos, but no real recurring presence. The wrinkle, in his case, is that a long-standing member of the town has been written out under disgrace, and the show has not given the audience any sense of what happened to him after. There is no episode in which Barbrady, the broken man, tries to recover his life. There is no episode in which the boys, who knew him for years, miss him. He simply vanishes. The town's relationship to its own police has been overwritten by the satire of one season, and the man who held that position for the longest stretch of the show has been allowed to fall into the off-screen. Father Maxey, the Catholic priest of South Park, is another character whose presence in the show has gone through quiet contradictions. He is introduced as a stern, occasionally pompous figure, the man who runs the Catholic Church for the town. He is, in early episodes, treated as a moral antagonist, with the boys at one point teaching him a lesson about empathy. Then, in a later episode, he is treated as a moral protagonist, leading a campaign against the Vatican for the systemic abuse of children, with the show's voice firmly on his side. Then in subsequent episodes, he flickers between those two registers, sometimes hapless, sometimes a clear moral compass. The drift is small, but the kind that accumulates. There is no consistent line on Maxey's relationship to his own church. The show has made him both a critic and a defender. The town has, around him, a Catholic population that varies in size from episode to episode. The boys are not Catholic, except in the episodes in which Cartman briefly is. The institutions that should anchor a real small town life are, in South Park, more or less interchangeable, and Maxey himself is, more or less, whatever this week's joke about religion needs him to be. Jesus Christ is a recurring character in South Park, with his own talk show in the early seasons called Jesus and Pals, and with a continuing role across the show's run as a real, walking, occasionally heroic figure in the town. He is killed and resurrected at least once across the run, by most accounts in a Christmas episode rather than the Mecha Streisand episode some fans remember. He fights Santa in some seasons. He is, in essence, just another resident of the town, with a slightly more dramatic backstory than most. The unresolved bit is the show's quietly unresolved metaphysics. If Jesus is a real and present figure in South Park, and if Satan is also a real and present figure in South Park, and if Mormon doctrine is, as the Mormon episode jokes, more or less correct, and if Scientology, as the Scientology episode jokes, has at least some elements of practiced truth, and if the Hindus, the Jews, the Buddhists are all real, then what is the metaphysical structure of the town? The show has not decided. It treats whichever religion is the subject of this week's episode as the one whose mythology is real for that episode. In the long view, this is a contradiction. The afterlives shown to us in different episodes are different afterlives. There are at least 3 competing hells in the canon. There are at least 3 competing heavens. The boys have visited several of them, and the rules in each are different. The show, in its way, has built a multiverse without saying so, and asked you not to compare the universes. Satan, separately from Jesus, is one of the show's most beloved continuing figures and the source of his own pile of inconsistencies. In the early seasons, he is the lover of Saddam Hussein. They live together in hell, in a domestic comedy that the show plays mostly straight. After a breakup, Satan moves on, dates a man named Chris, then has an arc with a violent and ambitious other partner, then is alone, then is parental, with a son who is, of course, Damien, who does not appear. He becomes, by the late show, a kind of melancholy figure of the underworld, a man who runs hell with reluctance and who comes up to the surface mostly when the town's problems have crossed into the metaphysical. He returns in the ManBearPig arc to acknowledge his role in the cover-up. He has an episode in which he becomes a friend to the boys. The accumulation is the issue. Satan has too much biography for any single arc to handle. The show has used him as the cuddly antagonist of so many storylines that the rules of his particular version of hell, the rules of his particular relationship to the boys, the rules of his particular love life, have all shifted depending on what the episode needs. He is, like Garrison, a character whose identity is whatever the week requires. Towley is the talking towel introduced as a satire of corporate cross-promotion in the show's 5th season, with the original gag being that he is constantly high on marijuana and offers the boys advice about how to dry off. The character is treated in his first episode as a piece of canon the show is uncomfortable with. The boys do not want him. They try to get rid of him. The episode ends with the message that the show should never have featured him at all. Then he becomes a recurring figure. He returns in subsequent episodes. He marries. He has a small towel child. He has a friendship with the boys. He has, in fact, his own episode arc about being a fully autonomous citizen of the town. The catch is the original premise. The first episode was explicit that Towley was a mistake, and that the show was apologizing for him. Every subsequent appearance therefore exists in tension with the show's own stated position. The writers have, of course, been making the joke deliberately. The repeated returns of Towley are a long con about the show being unable to honor its own first promise. But within the canon, there is a small contradiction. A character was introduced, mocked, dismissed, and then allowed to live a full life. He should not exist. He does. Cartman's psychic powers are an arc that the show treats with so little continuity that it becomes a sort of running joke about its own forgetfulness. In a couple of episodes, Cartman, after sustaining a head injury, or after eating something unusual, or after a near-death experience, can briefly communicate with the dead. He hosts a television program in which he speaks with the spirits of departed relatives of his classmates, including at one point the ghost of Kyle's grandmother. He uses the ability to torment the people who can speak to those ghosts. He then loses it, more or less, and the show does not return to it. In another arc, he is briefly able to use his enormous body to bowl with extraordinary precision in a brief moment of athletic excellence that the show shrugs at and never references again. Cartman has, in essence, a collection of unrelated supernatural abilities that he has briefly possessed and lost, and the show has never tied them together. The drift is small but funny. The boy, who is also a half-ginger, half-Tenorman product of a deeply weird town, has, on at least 3 occasions, demonstrated specific paranormal capacities, and not one of them has lasted into the next season. The show has decided again that the gag is funnier without arithmetic. Tweak and Craig is the most romantic small arc the show has staged, and one of its most quietly inconsistent. In the show's 19th season, the writers built an episode around a rumor that Tweak and Craig Tucker are dating. The rumor begins as a piece of fan art that the Asian fangirls who occupy the background of the school have produced. The boys deny that they are a couple, but by the end of the episode, agree to pretend for the sake of the town, which has become invested. Then, gradually, across the rest of that season and the seasons that followed, the show stops treating the relationship as a pretense. Tweak and Craig appear as a couple at events, they walk together, they argue together. They are presented by the writers as a genuine boy-boy relationship in a small mountain town, and the show clearly likes them. The wrinkle is that the show has never fully said whether the relationship is real or whether the boys are still playing along. The original episode is explicit that they are not actually dating and that the relationship is a performance for the town. Subsequent episodes are inconsistent. Sometimes they read as if the boys are now in a real relationship with real feelings. Sometimes they read as if the performance has simply become permanent. The writers have, in interviews, expressed warmth toward the pairing, but the show itself does not commit. The matter here is not about who Tweak and Craig are, it is about whether the show has decided. The longer the relationship runs, the more it is treated as a fact, and yet its origin remains a small piece of theater that the boys agreed to maintain. South Park has accidentally built one of the most loving, long-term relationships in its run on a foundation of pretense, and never been forced to say whether the pretense has become the truth. Tweak himself is an older example of the same kind of unstable identity. He is, in his first episodes, defined by anxiety, by twitchiness, by a high-pitched voice that has a small spasm in every other word. The early gag is that his parents are coffee shop owners and that he has been over-caffeinated for most of his short life. Then, in a later episode, the writers reveal that Tweak's parents have been giving him methamphetamine without his knowledge to manage his behavior. That reveal is treated briefly as a serious problem. Then, the show moves on. Tweak continues to be Tweak. The methamphetamine arc is never followed up. There is no episode in which the parents are arrested. There is no episode in which the school questions what they have done. The town treats it as if it has not happened. Years later, when Tweak is paired with Craig, the show treats him as if he were simply a slightly nervous fourth grader, not a child whose parents have been chemically destroying his nervous system for his entire childhood. The wrinkle is the same kind that has dotted the entire show. A piece of dark canon was introduced for a single episode and then left to lie. The character continues to function around the unaddressed harm done to him. The girls of South Park are themselves a long, quiet contradiction, in the sense that they are introduced one way and treated, by the show, very differently across the years. Wendy, Bebe, Heidi, Annie, Lola, Sally, Esther, Red. The names roll off the tongue, but in practice the show pays attention to one or two of them at a time and treats the rest as essentially interchangeable. In the show's very first episode of Focus on the Girls, in a season 3 episode called Cat Orgy, Shelley and Stan's babysitter are the center, but there are background gestures toward the structure of a girl's world that the show would build out years later. In later episodes, the girls have an entire arc about being the better gender, in seasons full of riffs on social structure, on dating, on hierarchy. Bebe is, in one episode, briefly a femme fatale because her body has begun to change. In another episode, the girls run the boys out of town and run their own micro-society. The shortfall is that the show then loses interest. The girls go back to being background, with the exception of Wendy, who is the only one given any real recurring interiority. The world the show built for them does not persist. The boys' world is, fundamentally, the structural reality of the show, and the girls are recalled only when a specific episode wants them. The whole, in their case, is the structural one. The show has clearly imagined a girls' South Park. It has, in practice, only had room for the boys. The goth kids and the vampire kids are the show's two main subcultural sidecasts, two cliques whose internal contradictions the show enjoys but does not really track. The goth kids are introduced in the show's 7th season as a small group of pale, miserable children who hang around the back of the school, smoking and writing terrible poetry. They appear in subsequent episodes, sometimes adopted by Stan when he is in a depressive phase, sometimes briefly transformed into emos, sometimes briefly transformed into vampires. The vampire kids arrive later, with the rise of the Twilight novels, and the show treats them as a separate cluster, the Goths' rivals. There is an episode in which the Goths burn down the Hot Topic to drive the vampires out. There is an episode in which the Goths nearly kill themselves trying to be more goth than each other. The trouble here is the way the show treats these clusters as both real and disposable. They are real enough to have multi-episode arcs and clear internal differences. They are disposable enough that when they are not needed, they disappear from the school's social ecology entirely. The boys' classroom is sometimes full of subcultural rivalry and sometimes empty of it, depending on what kind of week the show is having. The clusters have personalities, names, biographies, and yet they are gone for months at a time and no one in the school seems to miss them. The town's teenage population, in particular, is whatever the writers need it to be that week. Osimo is a wonderful one-episode invention that the show has, like Imaginationland, treated as both canon and not. In a mid-run episode, Cartman dresses up as a robot called Osimo in order to humiliate Butters. The plan goes wrong. Cartman is taken first to a military lab, then to Hollywood, where Osimo pitches a series of films, then back to South Park, where the truth comes out. The episode is one of the cleanest comedy structures in the show's run and ends with no obvious need to revisit. Then, much later, Osimo turns up again. The robot's design is reused. He appears in subsequent episodes as if he had a continued existence. The wrinkle is small. The original episode is explicit that Osimo is Cartman in a costume. Any subsequent appearance of an Osimo costume should be Cartman in a costume. The show does not always treat it that way. Sometimes Osimo is presented as if he is genuinely a robot in the town. The line between the costume and the entity is, as so often in the show, blurred to taste. The Trapper Keeper episode is one of the show's earliest pieces of science fiction satire and one of its most isolated. In the show's 4th season, the boys discover that the new Trapper Keeper notebook Cartman has bought is, in fact, a sentient piece of advanced technology from the future, and that a robot from the future, modeled on the cyborg from a famous science fiction film, has come back to destroy it before it can absorb the world. The episode plays the entire conflict at full scale, with the Trapper Keeper growing into a giant flesh tower, with the robot tearing through the town, with the future at stake. The episode ends with the Trapper Keeper destroyed and the robot succeeding in his mission. The catch is just the size of the event. The town survives a small apocalypse on its own street, and the next week is the next week. The boys do not, in any subsequent episode, refer to the Trapper Keeper incident. The boy in the center of the storyline, who in that episode is a small and central figure named Ike, does not seem to remember. The town does not remember. This is, by now, the show's most common pattern. Big things happen and big things go away. Crab people, the underpants gnomes, the aliens, the visitors, the small recurring non-human populations of South Park are each a kind of dangling lore thread of their own. Crab people are the secret underground rulers of the world in one episode and never mentioned again. The underpants gnomes have an entire economic model based on stealing underpants, which is famously, in their words, profit, with the middle steps of the plan unfilled, and they appear in occasional later episodes, but no one has fixed the gap in their business plan. The visitors, the small gray aliens, are responsible for inserting an enormous satellite into Cartman's body in the 1st season and then return throughout the show. Sometimes as a kind of cosmic check-in, sometimes as the punchline of a brief gag. None of these populations are reconciled with the others. They exist alongside one another in the same town. The town is, viewed honestly, a hub of several different cosmic conspiracies whose members do not seem to be aware of each other. The show does not see this as a problem. The town is large enough in the show's geometric flexibility to contain crab people, visitors, underpants gnomes, the cult of Cthulhu, the Mormons, the Catholics, Scientologists, hippies, woodland Christmas critters, alien experiments, sentient toilet paper, sentient towels, talking poo, and any number of further oddities. The contradiction is that, in any sane accounting, the town would be the most studied place on Earth. Instead, it is a small mountain village whose residents go on with their lives. The woodland critters are perhaps the show's most disturbing recurring lore. They are introduced in a Christmas episode in the show's 8th season as a group of small forest animals who are, on closer examination, dedicated Satanists with plans to summon the Antichrist. The episode plays this twist as a comedic horror, with Stan slowly realizing that the small creatures who have asked him for help are in fact at the center of a dark plot. The episode ends with Cartman revealed to have been the author of the story all along. It is, in essence, a meta-narrative gag, with the critters not being canonically real but a construction of Cartman's imagination. Then, in later episodes, the critters reappear. They turn up in Imaginationland. They appear in Christmas specials. They show up in a season finale years later as if they had been wandering the woods the entire time. The wrinkle is that the original episode was clear that they were not real. Subsequent appearances treat them as if they are. The show has not bothered to mediate the contradiction. They exist when the writers want them to, and they do not exist when the writers do not want them to, in the same way that so much of South Park's deepest lore lives on a switch. The Tuong Lu Kim reveal is one of the most genuinely strange pieces of canon in the show, and the kind of plot hole that does not really feel like a hole until you sit with it. For more than a decade, Mr. Lu Kim is the proprietor of the City Wok restaurant, a Chinese cook whose accent is exaggerated for satire, and who is treated by the town as the small, irritable backbone of a particular block. Then in an episode in the show's 15th season, the writers reveal that Mr. Lu Kim does not exist. He is instead a personality of a white psychiatrist named Dr. Janus, who has been suffering from dissociative identity disorder. Dr. Janus, when he is not playing Tuong Lu Kim, runs the City Sushi restaurant next door, in another exaggerated accent and another exaggerated identity. The episode ends with the doctor's diagnosis acknowledged and the identities partly integrated, though the show is clear that Lu Kim, as one of the personalities, continues to exist in the doctor's life. Subsequent episodes treat Lu Kim as if he were just a man running a Chinese restaurant. The dissociative identity reveal is, structurally, never referenced again. The hole is enormous. The character that the show ran for years has been reframed in a single episode as a mental health condition belonging to someone else. The subsequent episodes pretend the reveal did not happen. Either the doctor is still inhabiting the Lu Kim persona, in which case the show should treat him as such, or the show has decided to revert to the original reading and let the reveal stand as a one-off. It does neither cleanly. The character runs on as if nothing had happened, and the unresolved truth of who he is sits as a sediment under all of his later appearances. The Mitch Connor figure, the cult of Cartman, the hand puppet Cartman creates and then convinces himself is a separate person, is another quieter lore loop the show has run without resolution. The puppet in that episode betrays him. He is treated by the writers as if he had been a piece of long-buried Cartman psychology made manifest. The pattern is the same as Mr. Hat and Mister Garrison. Cartman uses a puppet to ventriloquize the parts of himself he cannot say aloud, and the show treats the puppet, episode by episode, as more or less real depending on the joke. The puppet has a backstory. The puppet has a romance. The puppet at one point is mistaken by the FBI for a third party. None of this is consistent across the show. The puppet is alive in some episodes and inert in others. He is, in essence, a placeholder for the small parts of Cartman's interiority that the show wants to externalize this week. As with Mr. Hat, the show prefers ambiguity to canon, and the puppet stays in the cupboard between appearances. Shelley Marsh, Stan's older sister, is one of the show's most useful threats and its least continuous teenager. In the first seasons, she is a girl with braces who is older than Stan, large enough to physically dominate him, with a habit of attacking him without warning when she is annoyed. The early gag is that her braces are enormous and that her vocabulary is mostly insults. She has, in those seasons, a small but real arc. She has a boyfriend whose presence Stan resents. She has a friendship with the babysitter. She has a few episodes in which she is the audience surrogate for a teenage perspective. Then she is largely set aside. Across the middle and later seasons, she appears sporadically, sometimes still a teenager, sometimes briefly considered as a near adult, sometimes back to her early register of monstrous older sister. Her age, like Ike's age, never makes sense. She was a teenager when Stan was 8. Stan is now somewhere around the same 8, plus or minus depending on the episode. She is still a teenager. The whole is the speed of her aging, which is to say, its absence. She does not, in the show's normal canon, ever become an adult. There are moments where she is briefly older. There are flash forwards in which she is grown. But the show, week to week, lets her remain at the same teenage age she has been for nearly 30 years, an older sister who has somehow never moved on to college, never moved out of the house, never developed in any way that would make her a recognizable adult. Her boyfriends come and go, her braces come and go. Her room remains the upstairs room. The wrinkle is just the size of the time elapsed without any of it moving. Cartman's apparent wealth, or lack of it, is another quiet inconsistency that the show has never tried to fix. He lives in the early seasons with his single mother in a small house with a small bedroom. He has in those seasons no allowance to speak of, no obvious way to fund his various schemes. Then in some episodes, he has access to staggering sums of money. He buys an amusement park with money he obtained by selling his hair. He buys $1 million worth of investments with money he obtained by exploiting his classmates. He builds, at various points, a complex toy collection that no fourth grader would be able to afford. Then, the next week, he is broke again, asking his mother for cash, complaining about the price of new shoes. The show has not fixed the contradiction because the show does not need to. Cartman is wealthy when he needs to be, and poor when he needs to be. His mother's job is whatever she is doing this week. The catch is the way these states do not connect. The boy who can buy an amusement park cannot, the next week, afford a packet of crisps. The mother who cannot afford to take him to a Broncos game can, in another episode, fund expensive private schools. The show treats Cartman's economic state as it treats his pure spite, as a variable to be set each week for the joke at hand. Jimbo Kern and Ned Gerblansky are two of the show's most fondly drawn minor characters, a pair of veterans who run a hunting shop in the town and whose friendship is one of the warmest in the show. Ned has lost his voice to throat cancer in his backstory and speaks through an electronic device. Jimbo is Stan's uncle. They have been together for so long that the show has, at one point, treated them as a kind of unspoken couple, while at other points they are described as old army friends. They appear in episodes about hunting, about the local cable access show, about the town's various sporadic emergencies. Ned dies at one point in an early episode, killed by his own hunting equipment. He is then back the next time the show needs him. The wrinkle, in his case, is the matter-of-fact way the show acknowledges his temporary death and then ignores it. He is not Kenny. He is not part of a running gag. He simply died and then was alive again, and the show has chosen not to comment. Jimbo, throughout it all, has continued to behave as if nothing happened. The hunting shop persists, the cable access show persists, the friendship persists. The show treats this pair with the affection of a comfortable old joke, and the joke is allowed to include a temporary death that nobody discusses. The 200th and 201st episodes of the show are themselves the center of the show's most public, real-world plot hole. In those 2 episodes, which aired in the show's 14th season, the writers staged a return of almost every celebrity the show had previously satirized, in a plot about a small goobag that confers immunity from ridicule. The plot rests on a reappearance of the Prophet Muhammad, who had appeared, plainly drawn, in a 5th season episode called Super Best Friends years before. In the 200th and 201st episodes, the writers chose, after extensive correspondence with the network, to depict the Prophet entirely concealed, first inside a bear costume, then behind a black censorship bar. After threats from extremists, additional censorship was added by the network, with the Prophet's image and certain pieces of dialogue obscured further. The episode in its original broadcast form is, since then, no longer available on most streaming services. The contradiction in the show's own canon is that the Prophet had appeared, plainly drawn, in earlier episodes, including the opening titles of the show, with no apparent objection at the time. The 200th episode acts as if it has always been impossible to show him, and as if the Super Best Friends had always been a group that the show could not display in full. The earlier episodes are not available on most streaming services either, with the entire Super Best Friends storyline effectively erased. The show has not discussed this in detail. The earlier episodes simply cannot be shown. The whole is the simple fact that they exist, are part of the canon, and have been effectively redacted from the official record. The film, called Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, is the show's largest single piece of canon and the source of several quiet contradictions. The film is set in the boys' world, but takes them through a war between the United States and Canada, with Terrence and Philip in the middle, with Saddam Hussein in hell as Satan's lover, with Kenny dead from the start and revived only at the very end. The film also contains the only on-screen scene in the canon of a deal being struck between Kenny and the devil, with consequences that are then partly returned to in the show. The trouble around the film is its uncertain placement. The events of the film are referenced in subsequent episodes only intermittently. The war between America and Canada has occasional aftershocks, but no real continued shape. The death and resurrection of Kenny that anchors the film is broadly absorbed into the show's general approach to his deaths. Terrence and Philip's marriage and family situations, established in the film, drift through later episodes without quite matching. The film is referenced as canon when the show wants to. It is ignored as canon when the show prefers. As with the games, this is the show's flexible attitude to its own past, applied to its most ambitious, feature-length statement. The streaming-era specials, beyond the pandemic, and post-pandemic ones, are themselves a continuity problem in their own right, because the show has chosen to release feature-length specials every 6 months for several years now while continuing to make regular weekly seasons. And the events of the specials have not always lined up with the events of the regular series. The Streaming Wars specials, for example, take Stan's father on a long arc about water rights and dairy products. The arc has consequences for the town that are barely acknowledged in the subsequent regular episodes. The Joining the Panderverse special has Cartman swapped into a parallel universe and returned. The events of that special are not weighty in the regular episodes that follow. The Not Suitable for Children special handles, with the show's typical sideways humor, the rise of online creators. The issue is structural. The show is now telling stories on 2 tracks at once, with a streaming track and a regular track, and the 2 tracks do not consistently sync. The boys live 2 parallel lives. In the streaming specials, they are sometimes adults, sometimes children, sometimes the children whose adult selves they are about to become. In the regular weekly run, they are children of indeterminate age in the same classroom they have always occupied. The show has, in interviews, treated this as a feature rather than a bug. The streaming specials, in their telling, are a place to tell the bigger stories. The weekly series is for the regular stories. But the regular stories sit inside the same world as the bigger stories, and the bigger stories have, in canon terms, not yet finished happening. The gap, in this case, is the most modern in the show's history. It is the gap of a series that has been on the air for almost 3 decades and that has, in its old age, learned to live with its own contradictions by simply releasing more of them. Tegrity Farms is the long, late arc that has occupied much of the show's most recent decade, and its emotional center is Randy's attempt to atone, by growing marijuana, for the kind of man he has been. The arc began, more or less, after the events of an episode in which Randy realized that he was a small celebrity figure from an earlier moment in his life, and that the realization had ruined many things around him. He retreats to a farm, he starts a marijuana company, he spends the next several seasons trying very badly to be a better man. The drift within Tegrity Farms is not its sincerity. The show treats Randy's attempts as funny but largely sympathetic. The drift is the way Tegrity Farms itself has shifted as a setting. It has been a small family operation in some episodes and a large industrial concern in others. It has been on the brink of failure in some episodes and at the peak of national success in others. The boys have moved out of their family home to live on the farm in some episodes and then are back in town in the next. Sharon has been about to leave Randy several times and then has not. The inconsistency of scale and tone is part of the joke. Tegrity Farms, like South Park itself, is sized to fit the joke. The result is a farm that has every farm story the show needs and never quite the same farm twice. The aging of the side cast, taken all together, is one of the show's biggest and most universal contradictions. Look at the parents in any of the families at the center of the show. Sheila Broflovsky has not aged. Sharon Marsh has not aged. Leanne Cartman has not aged. Stuart and Carol McCormick have not aged. Stephen and Linda Stotch have not aged. Their hair has not grayed. Their voices have not changed in any structural way. Their relationships, more or less, have stayed where they started. The babysitters of the early seasons have remained the babysitters of the late seasons, where they remain at all. The school staff have lasted, in their cases, longer than any real school staff would. The only character who is visibly aged in the show is Grandpa Marsh, who in the suicide episode was already at the edge of his life and who has continued to exist at the edge of his life ever since, with no further reduction. The town's elders never grow more elderly. The town's babies never grow into toddlers, or when they do, they remain toddlers forever. The whole here is the whole that contains all the others. South Park is a town that does not measure its own time. The world outside the show changes, the events the writers respond to change, the cultural conversation changes, the technology changes, and the people in the town are held in amber. It is, in its way, the same impossible state that the boys live in, scaled up to everyone they know. There is one further set of contradictions worth pausing on, which is the matter of the show's own opening sequence and how it has changed over the years. The opening credits of the early seasons, with Les Claypool's bass intro and the boys riding past various landmarks, contain images and lyrics that were updated and then quietly altered in subsequent versions. There are lines in the original opening that were thought too pointed that were softened in later cuts. There are visual jokes in the opening that no longer appear in the streaming versions of the same episodes. The contradiction in this case is small but persistent. The show that you can watch on streaming platforms now is not, in some respects, the show that aired in the late 1990s. The intro itself has been edited. Specific episodes have been removed or replaced. References that were once part of the show have been buffed out. South Park's own past has been quietly tidied, and the show that the canon is built on is, in places, no longer the canon as broadcast. That is true of many older shows. In South Park's case, it is particularly noticeable because the show's identity depends, week by week, on a relentless engagement with the present. And so the editing of its own past sites uneasily with its public stance on free speech. The gap is in the gap between what the writers say about their own freedom to make these references and what is now actually available to be watched. Cartman is the most consistent character in the show and the source of the largest unresolved moral question, which is the matter of what the town actually knows about him. By the time we are deep into the run of South Park, Cartman has, on screen, committed an enormous catalog of crimes. He has fed a boy his own parents in Chile. He has framed his classmates for various offenses. He has briefly tried to commit ethnic cleansing in elementary school. He has run a series of con operations involving large amounts of money. He has, in his time as Mitch Connor, briefly been wanted by federal agents. He has murdered in his fashion more than once. He has tortured Butters across episodes. He has used Heidi in an arc that the show treated as plainly abusive. He has, in his superhero identity, committed acts of violence at scale. And yet, week by week, he is just a boy in a class, ferried back and forth to his mother's house, eating his meals, attending the same school assemblies. The contradiction here is the simplest in the show. The town knows. They watched some of these things happen. They have read in the local paper about others. They have in their classroom seen him laugh about it. And they do nothing. There is no episode in which Cartman is in custody for any of his major crimes for any sustained period. There is no episode in which his classmates collectively refuse to be in the same room as him. There is in fact no realistic response to the documented behavior of this child anywhere in the show. The closest the writers ever come is the moment near the end of one season when Kyle simply gives up on trying to make Cartman care about anything, and even that moment is undone by the following week. The town's selective amnesia about Cartman is the largest single hole the show has, the one without which the show could not function at all. Every episode quietly requires that the boys forget what Cartman did last time. Every episode requires that the school keep him on its roster. Every episode requires that his mother continue to make him chicken pot pies in the kitchen as if her son had not, in some quiet corner of the canon, helped to dismember another boy's parents. The show could not exist without this forgetting. It is, in a sense, the engine that all the other forgetting depends on. The matter of who is in the boys' 4th grade class is itself a slow, shifting wrinkle. The classroom in the early seasons has Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, Wendy, BB, Token, Tweak, Craig, Clyde, Jimmy, Timmy, Pip, Damien, Kevin, Bradley, and a handful of others, depending on the episode. Over the years, some of these children disappear without explanation. Pip and Damien are the most famous examples, but there are others. Bradley appears with a clear identity and then largely vanishes. Kevin remains mostly silent in the background. Breeden, a son introduced in an episode about the boys' choir, vanishes entirely. The arrivals are also strange. New kids appear and are absorbed into the cast without comment. The boys' classroom is a kind of moving river of background children, with the central crew remaining fixed and the rest of the class shifting depending on what storyline the writers need to stage. The contradiction at the level of the classroom is what such a churn would mean in a real school. A real 4th grade in a town the size of South Park would have, more or less, the same students from September to June. South Park's classroom does not. It rearranges itself constantly. The desk that was Pip's is, the next season, Bradley's. The desk that was Bradley's is, the next season, an unnamed child's. The desk that was Kenny's is, in the early seasons after his death, briefly Tweak's. None of these arrangements stick. The room is treated as a stage rather than as a real place. Stan's depression is the most quietly devastating wrinkle in the show and the one I would like to spend the longest with. The episode You're Getting Old, late in the show's run, is the one in which Stan turns 10. And as a kind of birthday present from the show, his perception of the world begins to curdle. Every piece of pop culture he encounters now looks and sounds like excrement. The shows he used to love are excrement. The friends he used to love are unchanged, but he cannot see them clearly anymore. The world has, for him, broken in a way that he did not ask for and cannot fix. The episode is structured as a slow slide into a kind of bleak knowledge. The follow-up, Asperger's, supplies him with a kind of medical excuse, a diagnosis that allows the rest of the world to dismiss what he is seeing and lets the show roll back to its old shape. But the bleakness of You're Getting Old is real. The arc is, in essence, the show acknowledging that its own central child has, at age 10, become depressed, that the depression is not a passing thing, and that the world will not stop being absurd just because he has noticed it. The unresolved part is everything that has happened to Stan in subsequent seasons. He has not, in the regular series, been allowed to be depressed in any sustained way. The boy who in that episode was watching his parents prepare to divorce, the boy who started drinking, the boy who saw the world break around him, has been reset week by week to the boy who plays football and hangs out with his friends. The show has chosen to honor Stan's depression only when it serves the episode and to set it aside the rest of the time. The post-COVID specials, with their alcoholic adult version of Stan, are the show's quiet acknowledgement that the wound did not close. The regular series, every week, behaves as if the wound were never there. That is, more than any of the other contradictions we have walked through tonight, the contradiction that gives the show its strange weight. It is funny and it is unresolved, and it knows that it is both. Stan is fine. Stan is not fine. The show has not decided. The show may never decide. The Cartman and Kyle dynamic is, in some respects, the show's deepest accumulated piece of mythology, and one that has never been allowed to land. Across the years, Cartman has tormented Kyle in every register the show has available. He has used Kyle's faith as a weapon. He has tried to have Kyle's mother killed. He has built complicated and cruel schemes, the entire point of which is to make Kyle suffer. He has, when his attempts at cruelty fail, retreated and regrouped and come back again, year after year. Kyle has, at various points, tried to break the cycle. He has tried to be the bigger man. He has, in some episodes, attempted to be Cartman's friend, only to be betrayed and re-betrayed and re-betrayed again. There are episodes that treat Kyle's hopefulness as the show's secret moral compass. There are episodes that treat his despair as the show's grim joke. The wrinkle, here, is that the show has not committed to any single conclusion about the relationship. Some episodes end with Kyle deciding that Cartman is irredeemable. Some episodes end with the two boys at the same table, eating the same food, more or less in the same orbit. The cycle, in any sane reading, would have ended in the boys not being friends, in Kyle moving on, in the social ecology of the school rearranging itself around the simple fact that Kyle does not have to keep speaking to this person. The show does not allow this resolution. The boys are, every week, back in the same group, with the same dynamic, with the same set of complaints. The structural truth is that the show requires this dynamic. The show cannot survive its resolution. So the resolution is, every week, deferred. The full count of South Park's contradictions is, by any honest measure, impossible to make, because the show is, in its way, a sequence of small contradictions held together by a strong central voice. Every weekly story rests on the assumption that the audience will agree. For that week, to forget what last week implied. Every annual story rests on the assumption that the audience will agree, for that year, to forget what last year implied. The show could not survive a strict accounting. It depends on the audience's willingness to file each strange thing in a folder and never reach back into the folder again. And for the most part, the audience does. The pleasure of South Park is not, after all, the pleasure of careful canon. It is the pleasure of the show's quickness, of its willingness to react to the world that week, of its inhabiting of a small town that is a stand-in for the larger town we all live in. The contradictions are the price of that quickness. They are not, as some long-running shows treat them, an embarrassment to be tidied. They are, in South Park's case, the geometry of the show itself. If you were to draw an honest map of the South Park canon with all of its threads, you would find that the map is impossible to flatten onto a single page. There would be one corner with Kenny dying and Kenny living and Kenny under the cosmic curse and Kenny perfectly fine all at once. There would be a corner with Cartman's mother as both his father and as just his mother, with Jack Tenorman as the cleaner answer and Leanne as the older one. There would be a corner with the boys at the 4th grade desk for 30 straight years while presidents come and go above them. There would be a corner with Garrison as the teacher, as the woman, as the man again, as the president, as the teacher once more. There would be Chef as alive, as dead, as demonic, as the warm ghost the boys remember. There would be Pip as the small classmate, and Pip as crushed by a kaiju, and Pip as quietly excised from the seating chart. There would be Mr. Hanky driving toward Springfield, and Big Gay Al married to Mr. Slave, and both couples gone from the regular run. There would be Tweak dating Craig and not dating Craig at the same time. There would be Heidi mostly healed and mostly forgotten. There would be Damien on the bus to school and Damien never seen again. There would be the boys as 4th graders and the boys as broken adults at the same kitchen table in the same town, and the show would not, in any single moment, decide between them. The map is impossible because the show is impossible. That is, perhaps, the secret of its longevity. A more carefully built world would not have lasted this long. South Park has lasted because, week by week, it allows itself to forget its own past in order to be present. There is one last category worth touching on, and that is the show's own acknowledgement of all this. There have been moments, scattered across the run, in which the writers seem to be sending a small message to the audience that they know. The episode in which Stan looks at his old friends and finds them unchanged. The episode in which the boys meet versions of themselves from the future. The episode in which the town discovers, again, that it has been a kind of dream within a dream within a dream. The Cthulhu arc in which Mysterion confesses to having lived inside the same broken loop for years. The Imaginationland line that everything imagined is real. The post-COVID specials in which the adult versions of the boys realize that their lives ended, in some sense, when they were children, and that the children they used to be never quite came back. These moments taken together form a kind of meta-canon. The show is aware. The writers are not pretending that the contradictions do not exist. They are, in essence, asking you to live with the contradictions, because they have built a world in which the contradictions are the point. South Park does not want to resolve. South Park does not want to age. South Park does not want to admit, in any week, that any earlier week happened. The boys at the bus stop are caught on purpose in their own perpetual September. The puberty arcs are themselves a quiet shortfall the show has never quite reconciled. There are episodes scattered across the run in which the boys briefly experience the early signs of adolescence and then are walked back from those signs in the next episode. There is an episode in which the boys' bodies start to change in a small way, and the show treats it with the kind of confused panic the writers can mine for jokes. There is a related episode in which Wendy experiences her own changes with the help of Stan's mother, and the change is, in essence, treated as a real biological event. There is a BB episode in which her body changes faster than the rest of the girls and the boys collectively lose their minds. These arcs would, in any normal show, lead the children forward into the bodies of slightly older children. In South Park, they do not. The boys remain 10. The girls remain 10. The changes are revealed, treated with comic horror, and then quietly forgotten. The wrinkle is the basic one of the show's frozen ages, but it is sharper here because the show has explicitly engaged with puberty as a real thing happening to its real children, and then has chosen the next episode to pretend that the puberty did not begin. South Park has had its central children move through the early stages of growing up on at least 4 separate occasions, and has, in each case, hit a reset button by the credits. Halloween in South Park is itself a kind of compressed museum of the show's strangest contradictions. The boys have had at least a dozen Halloween episodes over the years, and the Halloween of one is never quite the Halloween of another. There are episodes in which the boys go trick-or-treating in a particular costume, and the costume is treated as a one-off. There are episodes in which the boys' costumes form the basis of a larger storyline. There are episodes in which Halloween is the setting for a return of a monster they have already seen and defeated, with no one in the town apparently noticing that the monster has returned. The spirit of Halloween in South Park, in canon, is not the spirit of Halloween in your house. It is instead a kind of folding date on the calendar that lets the writers run any of the show's old monsters again, with full assumption that the boys have never met any of them. Christmas works the same way. The town has had at least a dozen Christmases. The same Christmas figures, Mr. Hanky, Mister Garrison's Christmas songs, the woodland critters, Jesus, Santa Claus in his action movie persona from the Christmas in Iraq episode recur in different configurations each year. The town does not seem to learn what its own Christmases mean. The catch, here, is the smallest and the largest at once. The town has the same holidays as we do, and the holidays in the town are real, and the holidays in the town are different every year, with characters and figures the town should remember from past holidays appearing again as if for the first time. The boys, in particular, have met Santa Claus enough times that they should not be surprised by him. They are surprised every December. The boys' band, formed in the episode in the 4th season called Something You Can Do With Your Finger, is one of the show's most fully realized one-off arcs and one of its most cleanly buried. In that episode, Cartman organizes Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Wendy into a small boy band, with a name the show plays for ironic effect, and the band briefly nearly succeeds before Stan's father intervenes to humiliate his son out of show business. The episode is treated as a kind of love letter to the boy band era and as a real piece of canon. The boys in those episodes have musical talents we did not previously know they had. They write a song. They perform on television. They are, in essence, a real act. The fade is the way the band is then folded back into the show's resting state. The talents are not referenced. The performances are not referenced. The boys do not, in subsequent episodes, retain any of the musical instincts they were shown to have in this one. Kyle is in another episode, briefly a clarinet player. Stan is in another episode, briefly the lead vocalist of a Christian rock band called Faith Plus One, in a story about Cartman exploiting genre for profit. Cartman is briefly the lead of a death metal cover. None of these stick. The musical biographies of the children are, like everything else in the show, a flexible set of skills that can be turned on for an episode and off again at the credits. Faith Plus One is also one of the show's strangest small bits of canon because the Christian rock album that Cartman recorded in that episode supposedly sold large quantities, won real awards in the show's world, and was treated as a real cultural event for the town. The success of the album is one of the show's most explicit pieces of fictional business success. Cartman, by the end of the episode, has, in essence, made a small fortune. The Christianity of the album is, of course, the joke of the episode, but the money is real. Within South Park's canon, Cartman, by the end of that episode, has accumulated wealth. The next episode, he is, again, broke. The album is not referenced. The wealth is not referenced. The career as a small religious music mogul is not referenced. The catch is just the scale of the contradiction. A boy who managed, on screen, to record and sell a Christian rock album of mass appeal would, in any other show, be at least slightly altered by the experience. In South Park, he is, the next week, in the same 4th grade classroom with the same backpack on the same back. The economy of the show is what it has always been. The album is gone. Mr. Hat is the unsung whole of the entire show, the one we have circled around without quite landing on. He is a sock puppet, technically, on Mister Garrison's hand, with a particular shape and a particular face, and from the first season the show is explicit that he is a separate character. He speaks, he gives opinions, he disagrees with Mister Garrison. He has at one point his own romance with a sock puppet called Mr. Hat's wife. He is structurally the closest thing the early show has to a Mitch Connor. Then he is replaced. Mr. Twig, a small twig, briefly takes his place. Then Mr. Hat returns. Then, during one of Mr. Garrison's transitional arcs, Mr. Hat is essentially put away. He has more recently made small reappearances, sometimes silent on a shelf, sometimes briefly active. The unresolved part, in his case, is what happens to him in between. If Mr. Hat is, as the show occasionally treats him, a real presence in Mr. Garrison's life, then the silences between his appearances are a kind of unspoken absence in the apartment. If Mr. Hat is just a sock puppet, then the early episodes that gave him his own opinions and his own romance were lying to us. The show has never decided. It treats Mr. Hat as both, depending on what the joke of any given week requires. Sheila Broflovsky's name is, in a very small way, itself a continuity question. In the early episodes, she is consistently called Sheila. Then, in a small set of mid-run episodes, the show refers to her once or twice as Carol, which is Stan's mother's name, in what appears to be a brief lapse. The show recovers. Sheila is Sheila for the rest of the run. The lapse is small and probably not even intentional, but it is the kind of small thing that sits inside a long-running show and that fans collect like coins. South Park is, like any animated series with a long life, full of these small slips. The names get crossed, the colors of houses change, the model of a car a parent drives shifts between episodes, the eye color of a child briefly mismatches. None of these are contradictions in the storytelling sense. They are the small frictions of a show being made at speed for nearly 30 years. They accumulate, and they are part of what gives the show, in the strange way that this kind of show has, its sense of being lived in. The hindsight of all this is that South Park is not, finally, a show whose contradictions can be added up like a balance sheet. They are not bugs. They are not even, by now, particularly hidden. They are the structure of the show. The very thing that has allowed the show to keep going for almost 30 years is its refusal to honor its own past, week by week, in any rigid way. The writers wake up each Monday with a new piece of news to respond to and the freedom to ignore every previous piece of news if doing so makes the new story better. That freedom is also the source of the show's deepest moments. The show could not have made the Scott Tenorman retcon if it had been more disciplined about earlier canon. It could not have given us Mysterian's full speech about his own deaths if it had cared more about the deaths he had had before. It could not have made the Coon trilogy at all if it had been disciplined about the world in which the boys lived. South Park is not a show in the sense that Lost is a show. It is a show in the sense that Looney Tunes is a show, where the rules of the world rearrange themselves to fit the joke, and where the consistency we usually expect from television is not the value being offered. What is being offered is something rarer, a weekly, very fast, very loud, very contradictory document of what a particular town would be like if it had to react in real time to the actual world outside our windows. The contradictions are the cost. The contradictions are the price. And more than anything else, the contradictions are the reason there is still a South Park at all. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. If you sit with this show long enough, with its broken arithmetic and its forgetful town and its boys who never grow up, you start to notice that the contradictions are doing a small piece of work that is not really comic at all. They are doing the work of making the town feel like a place that has been there forever. A small mountain town with the same families in the same houses, year after year, while the world outside the town changes around them. The fact that nobody ages, the fact that nobody really remembers, the fact that the same children sit at the same desks while the country has 3 new presidents, all of this gives the show, oddly, a kind of warm pastoral quality. The town is a snow globe. Inside the snow globe, nothing ages. The arguments that happen inside it are the same arguments. The friendships are the same friendships. The classrooms have the same teachers and the same chalkboards. The bus stop on the same corner. The dog walking in the same yard. The contradictions are, in this reading, the spell that lets the snow globe stay closed. If the show insisted on its own continuity, it would have to follow the boys out of the 4th grade, into junior high, into high school, into adulthood, and the snow globe would be empty. By refusing the continuity, the show keeps the snow globe full. The boys are at the bus stop, the teachers are at the chalkboard, the parents are in the kitchen. The town is, forever, 4 streets and a school and a small church and a small bar and a small mountain at the edge of the eye. The contradictions are how the show stays in that place. That is also why, when you watch the streaming era specials with the boys as adults, The experience has the unsettling quality of having looked inside the snow globe at the wrong angle. Stan as a divorced alcoholic, Kyle as a tense and lonely scientist, Cartman as a Hasidic rabbi with a wife and children, Kenny as a half-mourned scientist who left a final letter behind. These versions of the boys feel almost forbidden, as if the show has, just briefly, lifted the lid on the globe to let you see what would happen if it did honor its own arithmetic, and then has closed the lid again. The fact that the regular series carries on with the boys as children, unbothered by the adult selves we have seen, is itself the largest single contradiction in the show and also, in its way, the show's most generous gesture. It is saying, very quietly, that the boys can become those broken men later, but not yet. Not while the show is still on. Not while we are still watching them at the bus stop. Not while the spell is holding. So if you found yourself, at any point tonight, drifting off, that is, in this case, the right response to what we have been looking at. South Park's contradictions are not really problems. They are pillows. They are the soft places the show is built to let it stay alive longer than any reasonable cartoon should. They are how the boys remain 10. They are how Kenny remains alive. They are how Cartman remains somehow in the same classroom as the rest of his classmates. They are the geometry of the snow globe, and they are also, in a quieter way, the geometry of childhood itself, which is a place where time also does not quite work, where the same conversations happen every afternoon, where parents do not really age, where summers last forever, where the people we know are the people we know, and there is no thought of having to know anyone else. Watching the show with all of this in mind makes the contradictions feel less like errors and more like the show's truest claim about what a particular kind of town really is. South Park has been on the air since the late 1990s. It has produced more than 300 episodes, more than a dozen specials, a feature film, 2 large video games, and a continuous river of weekly commentary on the world outside its mountain. It has changed its mind about almost every important question it has ever raised, and it has, in changing its mind, let almost every important earlier answer remain on the record. The result is one of the most internally contradicted long-running series in the history of television, and also one of the most beloved. Those two facts are connected. The show is beloved partly because it does not insist on being consistent. It insists on being honest about the week it was made in, and the cost of that honesty, week after week, is a town in which time has stopped, in which Kenny lives and dies, in which Cartman is forgiven by his classmates again and again, in which the same teacher returns to the same chalkboard, and in which the boys remain, forever, at the bus stop on the corner, waiting for the same bus. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.